Two young men stood on top of the mountain. One of them held a shovel on his shoulder. With them were four handsome creatures. They were all excited about something, as if they were thinking of something important. A white flag, decorated with some symbol, was flying above their heads. The dark-haired boy's name was Kim Soo-ho. However, everyone in this world knew him as Royd Frontera. He swung the shovel as if choosing a suitable spot. As soon as the shovel touched the ground, the space around him began to change for him. A city with many skyscrapers and streets appeared on the site of a recent wasteland. But so far, it was only in the imagination. Royd Frontera's companion's name was Gabriel. Royd turned to him, pointing to the neighborhood, and told him that this place would bring him great wealth. But Gabriel saw nothing around him and thought his companion was crazy. It all started a few years ago, when a sure absolute chose the then Kim Soo-ho to fulfill a wish. It was like a virtual game, so the guy became one of the characters in a novel he'd read the day before. He found himself lying on the ground in an unfamiliar area, right in the middle of the road. The weather was chilly. The cold and sleeping outside made the poor man's mouth twisted. The messenger informed Kim Soo-ho about the change in his body condition in a tone that was unpleasant. The young man stood up, trying to figure out if he was dreaming or not. Someone behind him called out to him. It was a tall, blonde-haired young man. Kim Soo-ho saw Gabriel Azrahan for the first time and recognized his new name. He found himself in the body of Royd Frontera, son of the local baron, and in front of him was still only the knight guarding him. But in the future, this knight was destined to become the most famous sword master on the continent. The newly minted Royd was furious, for everyone knew him in the neighborhood as a rabble-rouser. However, it was necessary to extricate themselves from this story somehow, and the two moved towards the mansion belonging to Baron Frontera. Lighting the fireplace, Gabriel asked his master if he remembered how he ended up lying in the road. Of course, Royd didn't remember that. All he wanted now was to be warm. He learned from the knight that yesterday at lunchtime, he began to drink alcoholic beverages and made a mess in the inn. And when he was tired, he went home, but he didn't get there very far. Royd touched his hand to the icy floor and remembered how warm it was now at his home in the other world. Gabriel left him in his room, promising to tell the Baron what had happened in the morning. He missed the words of the Baron's son, who asked him not to. Lastly, the lad asked the departing knight if there was much light in their house. But the man did not answer, thinking the question strange, and left. Left alone, Kim Soo-ho thought about it. After all, he had read the book and knew the end of the story. The Baron and the Baroness will be bankrupted by fraudsters, and then they will leave this world of their own free will, unable to put up with poverty. Royd will be forced to beg and pour out his grief until he ends this miserable life, choking to death. Kim Soo-ho was furious that the Absolute had placed him in the body of the Baron's eldest son. It was morning. Royd was looking around the mansion when his mother and Gabriel came across his path. Baroness Manhwa Frontera asked her son what he had done the previous night. He wanted to lie that he was only reading a book, but his mother already knew. She asked him to go to the inn and apologize for the mess. After a bit of thought, Royd agreed, because now he was responsible for the body he was in. The Baroness and the knight were very much surprised by this, but said nothing. The Baron's son and his loyal knight moved toward the inn. The boy noticed that everyone around him was scattering and hiding. The system informed him that the villagers hated him. Gabriel said he went with him to protect people in case of trouble and to prevent a repeat of yesterday's incident. But Royd's concern now was how to restore his reputation without putting his parents at risk of going broke. Then he would lead a trouble-free existence for the rest of his life. At this moment, the system displayed Kim Soo-ho Royd's skills, which included only the ability to make others nervous and a fondness for heady drinks. He waved his hands irritably and almost walked past the inn. After knocking on the door, the two went inside. Gabriel realized that something had happened to the gentleman last night because he didn't look like himself. Everything inside was ruined as if a wild beast had been here, not a man. Lowering his head, Royd Frontera spoke words of remorse for what he had done. The innkeeper had obviously not expected this and was stunned. He asked the Baron's son to leave and prepared to repel the attack, but he apologized again. The manner was rather rude, but the innkeeper accepted the apology, although he felt somewhat awkward. On the way back, the two young men talked about what had happened. Royd didn't understand why the innkeeper had a displeased look on his face. Gabriel said it would be good to make amends by paying compensation, and also that the innkeeper's mother was unwell and they had money for treatment. There was an endless stream of thoughts in Royd's mind. He wondered how he could solve all these problems at once, but he was hampered by the bitter cold. And then it hit him, because he just had to figure out how to heat the floors in the houses. For Kim Soo-ho, it was easy because he had the knowledge of a civil engineer and spent a lot of time on construction sites. It won't just be a way to help people, but a way to make money. Determined, he hurried back to the inn. The surprised knight followed him. The messenger reported the activation of the relationship point system. The system also notified Royd that improving relationships with the main characters can gain experience. The guy turned to his companion and saw that his interest level was minus 30 points, that is, negative. He immediately decided to remedy the situation by making an awkward compliment to Gabriel's beauty, but it didn't work. Interest dropped another point. A few minutes later, the boys were already in the inn. Royd and the innkeeper were sitting at a table, negotiating a contract to build a room with a warm floor. Part of the profits were to go to make up for the losses at the inn. The innkeeper's gaze was clearly distrustful. Then, the Baron's son decided to use one of his strongest traits. He began to press and persuade. After a short hesitation, the contract between the parties was still signed. Satisfied, Royd hurriedly tucked the contract into his pocket, assuring the innkeeper of his honesty. Outside, the knight began to censure his master for pressuring the innkeeper, but the young man saw nothing wrong with it. He attributed his behavior to cognitive distortion. An argument ensued. Gabriel was amazed at how his master could know such words and speak so intelligently. Meanwhile, the Baron's son picked up a shovel and began digging. He was already anticipating the smiles of joy on the faces of the innkeeper and his mother. But most of all, he was anticipating the soon-to-be profits. A week passed, and already the frame of the house began to emerge on the spot where there had been nothing before. The knight was becoming increasingly doubtful as to whether his lord was now before him. The guy was already struggling to hold the axe, but he wasn't going to stop. Suddenly, Gabriel grabbed his arm and took the axe. He decided to help in this noble endeavor and asked what was needed. A tired Royd explained the boards he needed, and the knight set to work. It only took a couple of swings of the axe for the swordmaster to have the necessary materials lying in front of his master. The astonished son of the Baron was not confused and asked the knight to help him in the same way with the digging. Without even a thank you, Gabriel regretted getting involved, but he couldn't refuse. He was still overcome with doubt, and at every turn, he expected a trick from the Lord. Now, they worked together tirelessly. Soon, the house with the underfloor heating was ready. Above the entrance was the logo that Royd had designed for his brand. The leaves were already falling from the trees, and it was time to show the result of the work to the innkeeper and his mother. The stove under the house was burning wood, and it was hot inside. But the innkeeper and his mother were happy. Their faces radiated joy. Observing this picture, Royd was satisfied with the result. His plan was beginning to take shape. The knight was becoming more and more convinced that his master was no longer the same as he had been known before. The system notified him of Gabriel's increased interest and improved relationship with the main character. The first house, built by the young people, was intended to serve as an advertising model. People from all over the village came to see it. At first, no one believed that the house actually had a warm floor, but it was so hot that people were coming out of there sweating. Not far from the table sat the author of the project himself, who offered everyone to sign a contract for the construction of such a house. People lined up in disbelief, but Royd Frontera turned on all his charm and hidden talents, until his father, Baron Arcos Frontera, showed up in the square. He asked what was going on here. His level of interest in his son was negative. In the evening, Royd met his father for dinner at the Baron's mansion. There were only the two of them seated at the long table in the great hall. The young man was worried. He had avoided seeing his father all this time. The Baron was the first to break the awkward silence. He asked what his wayward son was up to this time. The boy answered as if he had just contracted the innkeeper to heat the floor. Arcos Frontera warned him that he would not allow the locals to be deceived, but the young man assured him of his honesty and hurried away. He was just leaving when the Baron called out to him. Arcos asked him not to interfere with the family's problems and said he could handle it on his own. Royd had heard that somewhere before. He knew from experience not to believe it, so he urged the Baron not to give up too soon. Kim Soo-ho had been in such a situation once before, but he couldn't find the right words to support his father. He had already planned how many model homes he would build shortly. He was paid almost half of the deposit for his work. Suddenly, the young man's musings were interrupted by two strangers. They were the moneylenders Mitrov and Silo. They paid no attention to the Baron's son and went straight to his father's study. Royd decided to listen to what they would talk about and lurked under the door. The two men were quite insolent and rude, but Arcos did not lay siege to them, for they had come to claim his debt. At this time, the messenger informed the individual that he could enhance his skills by spending the experience points he had already earned, to improve his relationship with Gabriel. Of the talents offered, Royd chose surveying. Now, he could visualize his projects without blueprints. He also needed heavy equipment so he wouldn't have to dig by hand, but he didn't have enough experience points for that. The system reported the possibility of summoning phantoms as additional laborers. Royd had already imagined the fantastical creatures he could summon. A plan instantly matured in his mind on how to ward off the moneylenders and earn his father's approval. At this time, the moneylenders offered the Baron to sell either the furniture in the house or his wife and children. Arcos Frontera was furious at this insolence. Royd burst into the conversation, bursting into the study. He asked what right these people had to be in their house and if they had a letter of authorization. They had no letter, of course, and by the law of the kingdom, they had no right to trespass unceremoniously. The boy knew that, for he had read the book. He summoned his loyal knight and ordered him to cut off the hands of the intruders. Gabriel swung his sword, and the moneylenders immediately ran away in fear. However, the Baron was discouraged. He was angry with the young men because, in their position, it was necessary to beg the moneylenders for a postponement. In response, Royd handed him a sack of money that would pay this month's interest. Arcos Frontera was growing increasingly angry because he believed the money had been obtained fraudulently. But Gabriel promised to see to it that the building commitments his lord had made to the villagers were honored. The young men left the study. The knight asked how the Baron's son knew the laws of the kingdom. He only joked that he had overheard it somewhere. But really, he just knew what was next in the plot of the book. After the Baron and Baroness had gone to the other world, the moneylenders came to their burial place to dig up and sell their bodies. It was a dark, rainy night. But that didn't stop Gabriel. He stood in the cemetery and mourned for his masters. When he realized why the moneylenders had come, he spoke the law of the kingdom that forbade them to be here. One swing of the sword, and their heads were separated from their bodies. Royd also remembered that there had been a trial in which the knight had been completely acquitted. The messenger sent a notification that the Baron's interest had increased by 6 values. By improving his relationship with his father, the boy gained experience points and the ability to summon a phantom. As night descended on the village, Royd came to the knight's tournament grounds. After ensuring no one was following him, he decided to try summoning a phantom for the first time. Hitting the button to randomly draw fantastical creatures on Messenger, he prepared himself for something grand. Some symbols and gears appeared in the air. They lit up the surroundings with a soft green glow. There was a crackling sound, and a small hamster materialized out of thin air before the guy's eyes. Royd couldn't contain his disappointment. He turned and wanted to leave, but the hamster waved his paws, urging him to stop. The phantom spat out some paper that turned out to be a manual for him. His name was Podong. The instructions said to feed the phantom blue and red sunflower seeds. Then it would be able to change size. A set of 2 seeds cost 1 experience unit. The guy decided to see what Podong could do and fed him a red seed. And indeed, the hamster began to increase in size right before his eyes. He turned into a 10-meter giant, tossing Royd aside. Phantom had the skills of digging, reinforcing the ground, and puffing up his cheeks. This could have been useful for construction. The only thing left to do was to explain the presence of a giant hamster to the villagers. But human labor would have been nice too. The next morning, the young Baron was training the new workers from the military baronies. It was a small army of 30 men. They had to move a pile of earth dug up by Podong to the site of the new construction. Royd's new project was to be a boiler plant for Frantra Manor. The soldiers were unhappy that they would have to physically work. Usually, they were used to doing nothing. A tall, blonde-haired man came up behind him and asked why the Baron's son was giving orders to his men. The boy knew from the book that it was one of the 3 knights of the barony named Newman. He had Bayern and Gabriel Azrahan under him, and Newman was also a traitor. That's why Royd dreamed of putting him in his place. He said the Baron gave him full authority to command the army. Newman, of course, did not believe him, thinking that the young man had tricked his father into believing him. The Baron's son frightened the older knight by telling him he was going to get his ass kicked. Newman's face twisted in fury. Royd dug up the earth with his shovel and threw it in the man's face. The offended knight cursed the young man and his father. In response, the boy jokingly challenged him to a duel and received another round of insults. Later in the mansion, Frontera Gabriel Azrahan wondered why the young Baron had called the older knight to a duel, as it meant certain death. Royd said, picking his nose, that he wasn't sure he'd win because his opponent was much better with a sword. Looking at this, Gabriel couldn't understand what was going on in his master's mind. First, he throws mud at Newman. Then he challenges him to a duel. Then he puts Bayern in charge of the construction team. However, he's unsure of the outcome of the battle. Gabriel couldn't make sense of it. He struggled with feelings of disgust and pity for the young Baron. Royd requested training in swordsmanship, but the knight had no intention of doing so. Then, the guy offered a deal, fencing lessons in exchange for him giving Gabriel a cure for his insomnia. He wondered how Royd knew about the disease, but he didn't let on. The source of this information was, of course, the book. The book stated that Knight's nerves were too sensitive to everything, keeping him awake at night. But the young Baron was still able to put him to sleep merely by retelling him the manual of reinforced concrete structures. The next morning, the two young men were already in the ring. Gabriel gave the task of running 50 laps. Royd obeyed. He ran forward in pursuit of his goal and was willing to do anything to achieve it. The system indicates that he has improved one of his useless skills. Now, anyone who sees him will think he's crazy and want to hit him. The boy kept on running because he was very hardy. From a young age, he had to overcome hardships to survive and work hard. Gabriel marveled at his sincerity and will to win. His attitude improved by 1 point, and he decided to teach the Lord how to handle a sword after all. At that time, Newman and Baron Arcos Frontera were talking in the study. He asked the knight not to harm his son, but to teach him a valuable lesson. Newman gave lip service to the plan, but in reality, he had an insidious plan. He was going to send the young Baron and his entire family to the grave. A month later, the villagers gathered at the rifle range to watch the duel. Royd's parents were excited. No one knew how the fight would end. But the young Baron was confident and advised the older knight to get ready to take a pounding. He had a shovel in his hand. Everyone around him was surprised that he took a shovel instead of a sword, but it was a shovel made entirely of metal. Gabriel was confused. He had seen the young man preparing for battle and couldn't believe it was just a joke. Why else would he have brought a shovel? After all, he was also practicing with the sword. He also practiced physical exercises and supervised the construction site. Baron Arcos announced the start of the duel. The opponents took a stand. Royd thrust the shovel in Newman's face, making him very angry. He attacked the boy with his sword, but he deftly deflected the blow with the shovel blade. The Baron's son no longer looked like an awkward, inept individual. His technique of wielding a cold weapon amazed everyone around him. That's because Kim Su-hong was in the army, where he learned hand-to-hand combat. The shovel in his hands was a potent weapon. He could use it as a shield or to strike. The guy could even ride it. But the swordsmanship Gabriel taught him discouraged Newman. Watching the training, Gabriel improved his opinion of the gentleman by 1 point, and the young man's parents improved their opinion of him by 2 and 3 points. Thus, Royd had already accumulated 97 experience points. He spent them on improving his digging skills. But Newman had one last secret move in store. He was going to use it to send the young man to the afterlife. At certain times, he could fill himself with a special power called mana. It made him practically invulnerable. The knight rushed to the attack. The Baron and Baroness froze in horror. But Royd wasn't about to give up. Gabriel taught him his Azrahan core technique that made him the strongest man in the novel. The young Baron used it to rob Newman of his mana by knocking out his tooth, and then finished him off with a shovel. Everyone around him stood there as if thunderstruck. No one had expected such a thing. The dumbfounded Baron announced the end of the duel. The defeated senior knight lay on the ground and could not believe what had happened. Royd walked over to him and continued throwing punches like he'd lost his mind. Arcos shouted in horror at his son, ordering him to stop now. People ran onto the battlefield to disarm the guy, but he wouldn't stop. Gabriel noticed that the Lord was hitting his opponent in a way that didn't hurt him too badly. His face was calm and his mind clear. Even before the duel, a strange conversation took place between the knight and the Lord. Royd asked to be taught the Azrahan mind technique. However, this technique was Gabriel's personal invention, and no one else knew about it except the young Baron, especially since her concept had not been finalized yet. He didn't know how to finalize it himself, so he suffered from insomnia. To reassure the knight, Royd said he had learned of the technique when he put Azrahan to sleep, and he had mumbled in his sleep. Just then, he offered to help him complete the technique in exchange for training. The guy suggested that if you let the foreign mana from outside gather separately from your own without combining them, you could direct it in the right direction. The knight listened to his words. Together, they were able to complete the technique and even improve it. Before, he couldn't create multiple mana circuits, but now he had access to 3 at once. And if you keep going, you can get up to 4 or even 5. Royd's attitude increased by 5 points. Mr. Gabriel had learned to use only the mana he was touching at the moment. It was this skill that helped him win the fight. Finally, his father's shouts were heard, and the young Baron stopped beating Newman. He asked the Baron to look under the tablecloth of the table at which he and the Baroness were sitting. Some letters were lying there. Arcos picked one up and realized that it was a secret correspondence between Newman and the crook Rhodes, who was hurting the estate. The eldest knight turned out to be a traitor and a spy. This is now common knowledge. The young man learned of the existence of the letters while reading the novel. Although they were hidden in a secret compartment between the walls, Pudong was able to locate them and remove them. The Baron was confused. He didn't know what to do, so he kept silent. Royd suggested putting an angry rat on Newman's head and kicking the biter out of the village, or demote him and give him a chance to redeem himself. The Baron was a merciful man, so he chose the second option. But his son had seen a lot in his life, and knew that men like Newman were incorrigible. After begging for forgiveness, they're waiting for revenge. The young Baron pulled a red seed from Pudong's pocket and tossed it into the air. In front of the astonished people, the phantom grew to a gigantic size. It fell to the ground, crushing the senior knight underneath him. When the fuss about the duel had died down, village life returned to its usual course. The Pudong, to whom everyone was already accustomed, was carrying out new construction work. Gabriel asked what they were building. The Lord explained to him that their village would soon become popular, so they needed a good road. But the knight didn't stop. He asked how the young Baron knew so much, since he had never learned anything in his life. Perhaps he's not who he claims to be. Azrahan hesitated at his companion, and his hand reached for his sword. But by this time, Royd had mastered perseverance and convinced his companion that he studied in secret when no one was watching. He hurriedly ended the conversation and went about his business. A chilled Gabriel followed him, of course. The boys were on their way to Rudinia Manor, where the rogue Rhodes was rumored to reside. His business was bad. He who had cheated others was now broken himself. Along with his bodyguard, he was frantically looking for a way to make money. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by the intrusion of Royd Frontera, who opened the door with his foot. While Rhodes and the guard were in shock, the young Baron introduced himself. As soon as they recognized who was in front of them, they rushed through the window in a second. Gabriel was already there waiting for them. He offered the bodyguard, who was a dark wizard, to give Rhodes away, but he was loyal to his master and the money. There was a battle to be fought. There was one in the book, too, but then Gabriel was just a simple knight. Now, he possessed a heart of mana with a triple circuit. In terms of strength, he now outnumbered his opponent, and he retreated. The swordmaster switched to a startled Rhodes and threatened to sever his lower limbs. But Royd stood between them and shouted that he would not allow it, or else the knight would be punished. Gabriel froze with surprise. He had never observed Royd Frontera's sympathy for other people. In a moment, Rhodes was already sitting bound before the young Baron. He was shaking with fear. The guy tried to cheer him up by saying he wasn't going to take his life. That's not why they came here. The Baron's son needed his money, which was fraudulently obtained through Newman. He, therefore, offered the crook a labor contract by which Rhodes would be obliged to work for him for 520 years, while giving 80% of the profits to pay off the debt. The swindler, of course, was outraged by this, but he wanted even less to answer for what he had done in court. The treaty was signed, and Rhodes traveled with them to the barony as a servant. Besides, Royd took the last of his savings to use for construction. The scale was growing, but there was not enough labor. It was necessary to hire more people from the village. There was a huge line to get a job with the Baron's son. He was shocked to think that people hated him, but that's the way it used to be. Now, the guy has earned respect by building a heating system in the village. That's what Gabriel said. He also exposed a traitor. The people were grateful to him. The fame of the warm floors in the house had already spread to Raccoon Manor. Royd was looking forward to more construction contracts. However, to achieve this, a significant amount of resources had to be extracted. He knew how to do it. The barony was rich in forests and minerals. However, that meant that soon there would be nothing but stumps left of the trees. Road construction will have to be postponed. Instead, we need to start mining coal. It will be possible to sell it and earn a good amount of money. At first, Gabriel was outraged by the Lord's greed, but then agreed that it was the only way to get the estate out of debt. According to the knight, Baron Arcos could ban the mining. The villagers had already attempted to do so, but the mines collapsed due to the weak earthwork. Royd knew how to solve this problem. He was familiar with the technology of the shield sinking method. The enthusiastic young man was more confident than ever. But there was one thing he hadn't considered. As the young men left the forest, a hissing sound was heard inside the rock-filled mine. Thousands of red eyes lit up in the darkness. The peace of the ancient subterranean insects was broken. At the manor, Royd was using his finger to draw a plan for a new building. The design was average, but it was better than drawing with a pencil. The good thing about taking out Newman is that he earned a lot of experience points and applied them to develop his measuring and design skills. At night, The guy decided to walk around the neighborhood of the mine and scan it. He could see 5 meters ahead. The problem was how to knock out the passage in the shortest possible time. Without equipment, people can't do that. Peepodon got sick after overworking on road construction, so Royd decided to summon another phantom. He had just enough experience points for that. A tiny snake materialized out of the void. At the end of its tail was a bell. Just like Peodong, the snake fed on seeds and could change size, but most importantly, it could dig a tunnel. A few weeks later, the entrance to the mine was excavated. The snake was devouring the earth and processing it into red-hot metal. Pieces of hot metal flew out from the back of the snake. Gabriel chopped it into suitable fragments with his sharp sword. Blacksmiths forged these fragments into the supports for the mine's walls and ceiling. Work was in full swing. Royd and Gabriel worked tirelessly with the workers. During the break, the young baron scanned the earth's strata and finally saw a deposit of coal. Everyone around them rejoiced and cheered. Weeks of hard work had not been in vain. Thanks to the bell snake, it was possible to significantly reduce the work time. Royd was giving further instructions to the brigade when suddenly a rumbling sound was heard from underground. Scanning the space, the young man saw that someone was trying to break through to them from inside. A moment later, a giant ant burst out, scaring everyone into a frenzy. Royd and Gabriel were the first to rush into action. We couldn't let the mine collapse. With sword and spade, they separated the giant's limbs, disarming it. There was no mention of giant ants in the book. Their appearance came as a surprise. After dealing with one of them, the boys took a breath, but thousands of the same ants came out of the ground. The Baron's son ordered everyone to evacuate immediately. The two of them were trying to hold off the onslaught of the insect hordes. They had to figure out how to stop them quickly. The young Baron was even willing to sacrifice the mine to prevent the mutants from invading the village. Suddenly, he had a brilliant idea. He ordered his faithful knight to move forward to the attack. At this time, the workers reached the Frontera mansion and reported to the Baron what had happened. Arcos began to put on his armor in a panic. He was deeply concerned for his son, who was still trapped in the mine. Gabriel fought the oncoming ants. Royd needed to buy time. He scanned the space around him. He knew from textbooks that where there was coal, there was likely to be methane. All he had to do was find it. Finally, he saw layers of methane gas in the ground and started digging. The insects kept coming and coming. The knight's strength was running out. At that time, a loud whistling sound came from deep inside the hole, and the queen of the ants appeared. She was of enormous size. The boys were terrified. Gabriel couldn't handle her alone. It was fortunate that he now possessed the advanced Azrahan heart technique. The knight gathered all his power to defeat the ant queen. In the meantime, Royd kept digging in the ground. He had never worked so fast in his life. There was a hissing sound from the ground. It was methane. A deposit had been found. The young baron grabbed the torch and ordered the knight to run for the exit. The ant queen ran after them. As soon as they popped out into the narrow branch of the cave, Royd threw a flaming torch toward the monster. The methane that had already filled the space was ignited by the torch. There was an explosion. Everything was engulfed in flames. The army of ants was defeated. The knight covered his lord with his body and he was practically unharmed, but Gabriel himself lay senseless. The snake bell had also taken a beating. At that time, people gathered at the cave's entrance. They heard the sound of the explosion and were horrified. The Baron could not believe that he would never see his son again. The dead end, where Royd and Gabriel had taken refuge, had saved them from the rubble, but it was now impossible to get out. The oxygen was running out. The young Baron stood up and realized that he alone must get them all out of there. He started digging his way out. Not only his life depended on it, but also the lives of his two assistants. For a second, as he regained consciousness, the knight admired his master. His opinion improved by 6 points. With that, Royd gained additional experience points. He turned to the system to find the knowledge that would help them at that moment. Messenger offered 3 skills: absorbing the surrounding mana, processing mana absorption, increasing mana absorption. Together, they would master the Azrahan core technique. It was the only chance for salvation. Fortunately, Royd's experience points were enough, and he hasn't quit training since the win over Newman. He used some of the points to increase the level of this skill to 10, and the rest he invested in additional capabilities. The air was getting thinner and thinner, and the young man's strength was leaving him. So he chose not to feel tired for 10 minutes. Also, mana expansion would triple for 20 minutes. That should have worked. As he used them, Royd felt an unprecedented surge of strength and power. He continued digging and scanning the ground ahead of him. Finally, he saw a small gap in the ground. It was only 5 meters away. Oxygen was almost at 0 when the extra skills stopped working. There was one last burst of energy, and Royd used all his remaining strength to reach for the escape vent. Unfortunately, he was only 30 centimeters short. The guy collapsed. The thought flashed through his mind that all he wanted to do was live in peace. But he couldn't. There was a loud bang in the silence. The ground in front of the lying boy opened up, and he saw Podong. Fresh air was slowly creeping into the cave. Royd had never been happier. They were saved. At that time, Baron Arcos and his men were descending into the tunnel. Byrne tried to stop him, for it was dangerous to go any further. But the Baron couldn't leave here without his son. Whatever he was, it was still his child. A silhouette flickered in the darkness of the shaft. Arcos looked up and saw Royd. He carried Gabriel, his faithful knight who had always protected him. Using Azrahan's core technique, the guy, even when exhausted, could continue to experience its effects. The Baron immediately rushed towards his son and embraced the exhausted Royd. The next day, the news of the young Baron's heroic deeds spread throughout the village. He slept soundly in his room, guarded by Knight Gabriel. Finally, the Baron's son opened his eyes. The system informed him that the villagers considered him a hero. He was awarded 500 experience points for this. After the incident with the ants, workers have been rehabilitating the mine gradually. Now, they idolized their master, who saved the whole village. Royd and Gabriel were present daily during the restoration work. They also searched for possible refugees for the remaining ants. The knight didn't understand why the young Baron was searching on his own. He could have sent other men in his place. The guy explained that if he did it himself, people's trust and admiration would grow, and he could not be blamed for anything. Gabriel didn't know how to respond to such an answer, so his attitude towards the Lord didn't change. Scanning the nearby cave wall, Royd saw a hollow space. He began to dig, and a gruesome sight appeared before him. At the dead end of the cave, he saw a pile of dead animals wrapped in a sling. In the center was a creature chained. It appeared to be an orc. He was unconscious. The knight wanted to deal with him, but the young Baron stopped him. Turns out they found an ant storehouse where food supplies were stored. The Baron's son and his companion freed the orc and brought him to the mansion. According to the healer, the orc was paralyzed. The ants had immobilized him. Orc was given the necessary treatment and care. He soon recovered and was able to speak. He said that his name was Garrosh and that he was the son of the chief of the Steel Sand tribe. In gratitude for his rescue, he offered to help and participate in any way he could. Royd had long ago thought of something to ask the orc. All he needed was an army of 120 orcs. They would be a great help in the mines. Garrosh denied this request. Orcs are warriors, and as such, they obey only the commander's orders. Royd was not a commander. However, he had heard that orcs come of age after defeating a giant ant. That's the initiation rite. But the chief's son has failed in his mission, falling prey to ants, which means he can't be considered an adult. Royd decided to pretend that he and Garrosh had dispatched the ant queen, whose head now hung on the wall like a trophy. He convinced the orc by saying that he had won the fight but couldn't remember anything because he had hit his head, and the chief's son believed him. It appeared that Royd was now a great warrior, and therefore could command the orcs. An overjoyed Garrosh promised to talk to his father about providing an army of orcs. A week later, the expedition from the barony of Frontera reached the gates of the orc village of Steel Sand. But at his audience with the chief, Royd was again refused. The fact is, the orcs were fed fresh meat every day. This was a prerequisite for maintaining their physical strength. They had to hunt daily to feed themselves. The young barons suggested they find a way to keep the meat fresh, so they didn't have to hunt every day. Back when Garrosh and his father met, their embrace created such a shockwave that people could barely resist. Royd marveled at their strength then. The son of an orc chieftain could lift the head of an ant queen alone, and the rest of the orcs trained their muscles and used treasures instead of projectiles. They were chests of gold, some columns, statues, and much more. To build a meat storage facility, the young baron asked the orcs to pay with this treasure. A new contract was made. Gabriel asked again how his master knew all this. He only replied that he had heard it from somewhere. Granite was needed to build the refrigerator, but the young men did not know how to get it. They had no explosives. Royd had an idea. He remembered from the novel that a knight had once rescued prisoners trapped inside a magical barrier in the city of Namaram. To do so, he had to learn how to use the mana heart technique in a new way. It caused an explosion. The guy suggested that the knight protect the mana core with one ring and use the rest to attack. Gabriel approached the granite rock with disbelief. He drew his sword and concentrated on filling it with mana, using a new technique. He succeeded in blowing the rock to smithereens the first time. The explosion was so powerful that it tore the knight's clothes off. The level of sympathy for the master increased a little more. It was now minus 11 units. The experience points had also increased. The chipped piece of granite was delivered to the construction site by Pudong. The construction was progressing at a rapid pace. Orcs were showing people how to lift weights properly. All that was missing was ice and insulation material. Royd had sent a group of men after him, but they hadn't come back yet. He thought something had probably happened to them. We had to act. Royd hurried off to reconnoiter. Gabriel wanted to go alone, worried about his lord, but he didn't want to be left behind. On the way, they found a red glove on the ground. That was the kind of glove the workers of the barony had. Gabriel sensed that the flow of mana here was quite unusual. The young baron suddenly remembered reading about it in the pages of a novel. It spoke of a magical influence. He ordered the knight to flee. Perhaps none of their workers were alive anymore. The companions reached a vast gorge. It was named after the dark sorcerer Rufalin who lived there. There was a cave next to the gorge. There were remnants of insulation material lying near the entrance. Workers had probably been here. Royd was very angry. By what right did someone dare steal his men? Gabriel was the first to enter the cave, but didn't notice some kind of magical sign on the ground. It was a trap. It's a good thing the young baron was able to pull him away. There was an explosion, but the knight was unharmed. In the book, he didn't notice the trap either and was severely injured. Royd's presence kept him safe. He asked the knight to use the mana technique to detect traps in places where its flow changes. Gabriel dared not disobey. They began to move deeper into the cave, avoiding the traps that lay ahead. At that time, someone in dark robes sensed their approach. It was Rufalin, the powerful wizard. He opened the deadbolt on the steel door and looked around at the captive laborers who sat in confinement. Selecting one, he pulled it by the hair and placed it in the center of the magic circle. The frightened poor man begged for mercy. The wizard needed him for some dark ritual. Rufalin swung, but he was called from behind. It was Royd and Gabriel. In a frenzy, the dark wizard put a magical wall between him and them. He intended to put them to sleep by launching a soporific gas. The young baron held his breath, but the knight's eyes were already closing. Royd applied the ability to not feel tired for 10 minutes and started digging. In seconds, they were already under the wall and Gabriel used a mana technique. The explosion caught Rufalin, who had been casting a spell, by surprise. He jerked back in surprise. The young baron emerged from the undercroft, and then his faithful companion. What they saw in the dark wizard's lair made them freeze in amazement. He continued his sinister ritual. The entire cave was lit up with a scarlet glow. A vast, two-headed, ugly, furious monster appeared in front of them. While Royd pondered what to do, the knight threw himself into the fight. He used the power of the explosion to split the monster in two. The young baron didn't know about this ability. Gabriel must have invented it himself. After the mutant was dealt with, the companions looked down on the defeated Rufalin. He had no more trump cards. The guy sat down and asked the wizard how he was going to pay for the stolen workers. He had caused the construction site to shut down. The dark magician begged for mercy. He offered to take everything he had without taking his life. Royd agreed. At this time, Gabriel was leading weakened, desperate laborers out of confinement. The young baron wondered what Rufalin was going to do with the men. He told him the story of having a family and serving as a baron. A cruel baron had attacked his wife. They tried to escape. The baron pursued them, and in the course of the chase, the wife and child went to the other side of the world. Rufalin's purpose in life became research. He wanted to bring his beloved and his child back from the dead, but his experiments required living people. His experiments failed one after another. A significant number of innocent people were deprived of their lives. Royd said Rufalin was a villain because he didn't spare the family of the souls he'd ruined. His story didn't move the young man. He said he would return later for the valuables the dark wizard promised. In the meantime, he and his men are leaving his lair. The young baron, accompanied by his knight, turned his back to the wizard. He knew it was dangerous, but he did it anyway. He remembered from the book that Gabriel had spared Rufalin, but he continued to experiment on himself and became a horrible monster that haunted the knight for a long time. As soon as they turned, the dark mage rose from the ground and attempted a magical strike to the back. Gabriel reacted in time and separated the wizard's head with one blow. In his previous life, when Kim Soo-ho worked at a construction site, there was a man who constantly bullied him. It was the same worker, no better. Day in and day out, the boy had to endure ridicule. The young man restrained himself so that there would be no conflict. But one day, the offender insulted his mother, and the boy could no longer restrain himself. He attacked the boar with his fists and punched him everywhere until he was dragged away. After that incident, the mockery stopped, and Kim Soo-ho always remembered that evil must be punished. The bully became afraid of him. People were leaving Ruflin's cave. He couldn't hurt anyone else. The tired travelers were walking towards the orc village of the Steel Sand tribe. The workers were carrying insulation material on their backs, so they strolled. Royd offered to help one of them, but he refused. The Baron's son couldn't be allowed to carry the weight. But the guy insisted. He took the burden from several workers at once. Tears of gratitude welled up in their eyes. They were deeply touched by their master's care. In the orc settlement, the meat storage was already ready, but it was hot. Garrosh couldn't figure out how the meat would be stored. He doubted Royd's honesty, but remembered how he had saved him. The man couldn't be a liar. The guy calmed him down. He said the vault wasn't ready yet, and it would be cold soon enough. When Gabriel and Royd were left alone, the knight asked where they would get the ice. However, the young man was unaware of this at the time. He was sure he would find a way. He just had to sit down and think. But the knight was not so sure. He thought their enterprise would fail. Sitting by the cliffside at night, Royd pondered the situation. He had to get a massive cube of ice somewhere. Peepodong and Bell can bring water from the lake, but it will need to be cooled in some way. The young man knew from the novel that ice magic existed in this world, but of course he didn't have that ability. But he could figure out how to freely alter the flow of mana. With continued training, it was possible to achieve such a result. All you have to do is remove all the heat energy from the water. Then all that's left is cold energy. It didn't work out for Royd at first, and Gabriel looked at the whole thing with skepticism. But the master's efforts were not in vain. Soon, he was able to develop Azrahan's mind technique to the point where he could access the 2 circuits around the core. A couple days later, a massive cube of ice appeared in the vault. The orc chieftain and his son could not believe their eyes. They were happy that now they wouldn't have to throw away spoiled meat and hunt every day. This was something to celebrate. Royd and Gabriel were very pleased with the work done. The grateful orcs paid in treasure and provided an army of 120 soldiers. They now considered the son of Baron Frontera as their blood relative. This meant a guarantee of protection and assistance. Bonus points for helping the orcs brought additional experience points. The value increased to 611 units. Not only did the expedition return home in full force, but also with orcs. The villagers, of course, were horrified, but Royd had prepared a formal address for them. They were their friends now. The Baron and Baroness didn't expect to see such a thing either, but accepted their son's mischief. Especially since the guy brought the orcs riches to the manor. All that remains is to find a buyer for these relics. Royd sat on the floor of his room, studying the artifacts that Ruflin had left behind. There were many strange magical things and books among them. Suddenly, he found in the book the very spell with which the dark magician wanted to bring his family back from the other world. The young Baron jumped up and ran to the mine. There, he looked for Rhodes, who was doing his duty. He was contracted to serve for 520 years. But since people don't live that long, he couldn't pay off the debt in full. But now it's possible. The young Baron was happy to inform him that once he went to the other world, Royd would be able to bring him back with the help of a ritual. The young man laughed joyfully, and Rhodes cried. The prospect was not a happy one for him. Satisfied, the Baron's son returned to the manor and decided to look for his father, but he was not in his study. The maid said that Arcos was receiving guests in the main hall. They were the moneylenders, Salo and Mithrophis. The young Baron rushed there urgently. He had an ingenious plan. The moneylenders came to make an offer to the Baron. They took a letter of authorization with them. Silo said that Arcos could pay only 10% of the debt on the condition that he would give the usurers the right to own the mine. The Baron thought about it. The offer was favorable, but the mine was necessary for the barony. A lot of time and effort had been invested in it. That's when Royd showed up. He had his own proposal. The loan sharks immediately tensed up. He proposed to reduce the interest on the debt so that he could start paying it off in installments. The proposal was met with a negative response. Then, the Baron's son roared that he was furious. Heavy footsteps were heard outside the door. It was Garrosh. He heard that his blood brother was unhappy about something and hurried to punish the offenders. The usurers cried out in horror. It was the first time they had ever seen a real orc so close. Royd threatened that if they did not accept the offer, they would insult him to the core and receive retribution. The frightened crooks immediately signed the contract on the new terms and rushed out of the mansion. Handing over the document, the young Baron informed his father that he had signed many construction contracts and soon they would be able to pay off the debt in full. But he didn't have good news. The fact was that orcs consumed a significantly greater amount of food than humans. That could be a problem. Orcs became excellent masons. They worked tirelessly for 24 hours a day. They literally had to be dragged out of the mine by force. The coal was being extracted much faster than Royd had hoped. They didn't demand money, but they needed a lot of food. The barony could barely provide them with food. Sitting in his father's study, Royd pondered the problem. The only way out was to raise taxes. But Arcos was against it. The people were already poor, and there was nowhere to raise taxes. Then, the young baron suggested that people could earn more. In this case, the increase would not be reflected in the wallet. In the north of the barony, there were empty marshlands. Royd decided to give it to the peasants so they could farm it. However, it was first necessary to make these lands suitable for growing crops. Upon arriving at the site, the guy made a mock-up of the flooded land to come up with a drainage solution. He tried various ways to drain the makeshift swamp, but nothing worked. 21 days the young baron spent alone with the maquette without even interrupting to eat or sleep. Gabriel and Arcos watched anxiously from afar. The knight offered to interrupt Royd, but the baron stopped him. He said that not so long ago he hated his son. Now, he's proud that he's working hard for people. He shouldn't have gotten in the way of that. The system notified him that the baron's sympathy level had increased. Royd's experience level was now 931 points. Finally, at night, the guy succeeded. The water on the layout went away, draining the center section. The young man shouted with joy, anticipating a trouble-free future life. He was exhausted, but happy. At the same time, the skill of design was pumped up, allowing you to model anything without drawings. To carry out the plan, the boy needed help. He took Padong and Bell. Together, they went to the swamp. The scope of work was enormous. All the water had to be pumped out. The two of them couldn't do it alone. Royd decided to spend the points on another phantom. He hoped to summon something that resembled a hamster and a snake, yet possessed the same properties. A small ball popped out of the green haze and hit the guy in the nose. It turned out to be a little hippo named Hippo. The creatures were happy to see each other and danced around each other. The young man asked for an instruction manual for the new phantom. Hippo was significantly different from the others. He did not know how to adjust the grain size. Royd wasn't happy with the phantom. He wanted to change it, but it was only available once a day. The little creatures were upset and hurt by his distrust of them. They begged their master not to give up Hippo. The disappointed guy asked the phantom what skill it possessed. But the little guy wasn't so simple. He could absorb water. Under Royd's skeptical gaze, Hippo walked over to the swamp and began to drink. He drank and drank and drank, growing to an incredible size. The swamp shrank by leaps and bounds. The young baron certainly hadn't expected this. His face contorted with shock. The next day, people arrived at the swamp to begin construction. At first, they were frightened by Hippo's huge appearance. The guy decided to apply a vertical drainage method to prevent water from accumulating. It consisted of drilling vertical wells. The hippopotamus finished the rest of the water and poured it into the river nearby. Then, the workers removed the remaining plants and loosened the soil. Gabriel made holes in the ground where bamboo poles were inserted. Podong tamped down the soil around them. The water collected inside the poles, and Hippo drank it. Every day, the swamp was transformed into a field. Royd cheered up the workers by promising to throw a party at the end of the work. Looking out over the blooming land, Gabriel pondered what he was even doing here. A young gentleman ran up to him and asked him to plant the first seeds around the perimeter. The knight tried to protest, but Royd convinced him that it was necessary for the defense of the manor. The baron, baroness, and all the villagers respected the guy more and more, who just a short while ago had been a useless drunkard. The satisfied young man had been accumulating experience points for future victories all along. Very soon, the first young sprouts appeared in the field. The previously lifeless ground was covered with green. Even Gabriel enjoyed tending to the plants. The gentleman sitting next to him was making plans to build a water wheel. Men on horseback appeared in the distance. They were in a warlike mood. It was Viscount Racona himself, the master of the neighboring lands, along with his servants. His attorney questioned the young people in charge of the construction site. Royd replied that he was in charge there and asked what was wrong. It turned out that part of the marshes belonged to Viscount Racona, and no one had the right to be here without his knowledge. The young baron interrogated whether the Viscount really thought they had entered the grounds without permission. The Viscount's attorney replied that these lands were granted by the king himself. Still, the lad interrupted him, ordering him to shut up. Everyone around them froze, not knowing what to expect in the next moment. The young man introduced himself as the eldest son of Baron Frontera, but the Viscount did not wish to speak to him and asked him to call his father here. Royd pretended not to hear the request and insulted the Viscount by comparing him to a dung fly. He behaved so boldly because he was well versed in the local laws. One of them stated that anyone could establish ownership of lands that had been abandoned for over 100 years. Everyone listened to the young baron in amazement. Their labor had been invested in these lands, It was possible to build dwellings and farms in that area. But the most important argument is the first harvest. Royd took it off in public by pulling a bulb out of the ground. The Vicomte was simply furious. He didn't expect to be rebuffed. Gabriel suddenly realized what the Lord had asked his bough to be planted around the perimeter of the field for. The young baron handed the bulb to the Viscount and asked him to remove himself. The humiliated nobleman and his subjects had to retreat with nothing. Azrahan asked how the Lord could have known in advance of the invasion, but he replied that he did not know, but only assumed. The joyous men praised the baron's son for being able to defend the land. The embarrassed boy ordered them to continue their work. Summer was coming to an end, and with it, the warm weather. It began to rain heavily on the baron's estate. Royd and his loyal knight did not leave the field. They wanted to make sure the water wheel was properly draining the water. When the sun appeared from behind the clouds, the young men saw that the plantings were not flooded. The system reported improved measurement and design skills. The individual could now estimate the value of land and examine it more closely, and also visualize volumetric drawings and model the terrain plan. Experience points have also been added. At Raikon's estate, the steward explained to the master that Baron Frontera's men would be cultivating the new land for the next 2 years and would not be able to abandon it. The Viscount was furious at the loss of his fortune. He could not bear to see his lands taken away. Ramona ordered an urgent council meeting. It was necessary to figure out how to regain possession. A couple days later, Royd woke up in his room with a wild headache. Gabriel wasn't feeling well either. The master began to suspect something was wrong. The headache tormented even Emily's maid and the villagers. The animals on the farm were also sick and refused to drink. Maybe it was the water. From the book, Royd knew that Viscount Raikon's primary activity was the development of secret technology in fabric dyeing. He realized where the wind was coming from. He was incredibly pissed off that someone was giving him a hard time. At this time, Viscount Raikon's attorney sat in the baron's office and insisted that the lands be returned. He admitted that the poisoned drinking water was their doing. If the land is returned, the water damage will stop. Arcos threatened him with a lawsuit. However, he didn't take into account that court proceedings could take years and clean water is needed immediately. To bear the cost of court fees and the purchase of drinking water, the barony had no funds. The baron shouted that he would not give up a piece of land his son had cultivated. The Viscount's knight grinned achidically and was about to retire. However, Royd burst into the office and slammed the door on the unfortunate man. The son came to tell his father that he had figured out who was poisoning the water. At this time, the Viscount's knight recovered from the blow and recommended being more polite to him. But the young baron called him a parasitic brat. That was the second insult. A duel was imminent. The rivals entered the ring, but the fight was short-lived. Royd beat the noble knight with a shovel without a word. Baron Arcos had such a happy face at this that even Gabriel was amazed. At Raikon's estate, the Viscount reprimanded his knight for losing the duel and returning with nothing. But now they could sue for assaulting a nobleman. The proceedings could drag on for several years, which would hit the baron's wallet. But Royd wasn't so simple either. He was determined to defend himself. Anticipating this, he addressed the people. To solve the water problem, a storage facility in the form of a reservoir was required. Hippo will be able to move clean water from areas that have not been contaminated yet, but it's only a temporary measure. Not far away was the Kapua River, a mountainous river with the purest water. We had to figure out how to build a waterway from it to the barony. Royd was already looking forward to a lucrative new project. However, he first had to spend a considerable amount of money and time. A couple of months later, the young baron had already requested an audience with the Viscount. He came to him with a proposal. He sat in front of the Viscount and told him what the event had cost him, but the boy had come for more than that. The workers were hindered by a huge valley when laying the waterway. They had to build an aqueduct. Limestone was needed for its construction. During mining, fragments of lime were scattered around the area. Some of it ended up in the river that ran through the Rakona estate. This water was used to dye cloth. The water chemistry changed, and the quality of the fabrics deteriorated significantly. The Viscount's production suffered. The master of the workshops was furious at this statement. He cursed the baron's son and threatened to sue him. The latter only parried that the reputation of the production would be irrevocably damaged while the proceedings were ongoing. All the Viscount could do was threaten his connections in the back of a departing Royd. On the way home, Gabriel asked why the Lord had angered Rakona since he would stop at nothing to see this through. But the guy was confident of success. He knew that the production would be significantly damaged in any case. A month later, the Viscount was already at Frontera Manor, begging to stop clogging his water with lime. He lay on the floor and humiliated himself in front of someone he had recently humiliated himself. Then Royd offered him another contract. He asked for a tribute to restore the fabric dyeing shop. The payout amount was lootable, but Raccoon had nothing to do but sign the contract. This money would enable the barony of Frontera to settle its debts and thrive. Everything Royd did was good for the village, but he was getting greedier and greedier. His father told him there was a buyer for the orc treasure. It was Count Cremo. Specifically, he wanted a bronze statue of some kind. At this time, in the market town of Cremo, the Count was looking out of his window at the water's surface. The water churned and opened before his eyes. A vast sea monster emerged from the depths. It was the Titan Giga. In the garden of Frontera Manor, the Baron was tending the flowers. Gabriel stood beside him and reported on Royd's future plans. Arcos shared with him that he used to be hesitant and fearful, but seeing how brave his son had become made him want to match it. The knight objected, saying that the Baron was the kindest man he knew. Arcos once saved little Gabriel from cold and hunger. Now, the father saw his son as a great successor. He was capable not only of paying off his debts, but also of increasing his wealth. The knight wanted to argue that Royd was only interested in money, but changed his mind. The Baron ordered him not to leave the heir a single step and always protect the young man. Gabriel was very grateful to Arcos, so he promised to follow orders. The boy, who was once taken in by the Baron, had only one dream. He wanted to be a knight very much. Arcos carved a toy sword out of wood with his own hand and gave it to the child. Little Royd mocked him and his dream constantly. That was why Gabriel had always disliked him, but he had to accompany the young Baron all the time. He even slept next to him in a chair. All because his monotonous narrative of engineering and construction put the insomniac knight to sleep. However, the more time they spent together, the more his attitude changed. Gabriel hated himself for it. It was a dark and stormy night. The window to the young people's room was open. Suddenly, someone in dark robes jumped from the street onto the windowsill. He drew his sword and tried to pierce the chest of the soundly sleeping Royd. The knight's sensitive sleep was disturbed. Gabriel clashed with the intruder. The opponent's sword broke in the duel. A loud sound woke up the sleeping lord. When he opened his eyes, he saw a knight and a stranger who had been defeated. It was a subject of Viscount Racon, whom he had dismissed. The news was immediately relayed to the Viscount. Gabriel had one question. If Royd knew about so many events in advance, why didn't he try to prevent them all? The Lord replied that he had no need to prepare, for his faithful knight was always there to protect him. The young Baron trusted Gabriel as himself. The man was silent in surprise. He didn't know how to feel about Royd. Without wanting to, he had gotten rid of a long-standing grudge, and his interest level began to rise. Meanwhile, the construction of the pipeline was nearing completion. The next big thing on Royd's list was a trip to Cremo to sell orc treasure. Soon, a small group of men from the barony of Frontera advanced on horseback. Royd rode along with Gabriel because he didn't know how to stay in the saddle. He was just falling asleep when he felt a jab to the jaw. It was a dream come true. The boy asked indignantly if it was a deliberate blow or if he'd imagined it. The knight was annoyed that he had to carry Royd and sleep on top of him. The young Baron immediately got off his horse and ordered everyone to stop. He asked Gabriel to teach him how to ride right away. The knight refused, saying he was not a teacher, but the master insisted. In the end, Azrahan gave in. The messenger said that because of the construction of the water pipeline, the fame of Royd had spread throughout the kingdom. He now had 2,275 experience points. He smiled because it meant a lot of new contracts were coming in. Gabriel thought his master had lost his mind. That Royd might learn to keep in the saddle, the knight went on foot and led the horse by the bridle. The journey to Cremo was not a long one. When they arrived, it was the middle of winter. The Count greeted the travelers warmly. He had heard of the young Baron's deeds. He initially mistook Gabriel for Royd. It was not surprising, for the knight was very handsome and had an aristocratic air about him. Count Cremo immediately asked if he was engaged. It was because he had a daughter, and this union could be beneficial to both families. Royd tried to get a word in, but the feudal lord shouted at him. When the situation was cleared up, he, of course, apologized to Baron Frontera's son for mistaking him for a servant. The Count played a massive role in the book. When Gabriel was on the run, it was he who offered his help and became his associate. Cremo told me that 2 years ago, his trade deteriorated. Giant monsters appeared in the sea. Though they didn't attack ships, they were terrifying. The young Baron knew nothing about it, for he had only read the first part of the novel. The Baron also said that the monsters were afraid of mermaids. The sea warriors could handle the giants with skill. So, he decided to erect a mermaid statue in the sea to ward off the monsters. However, to do this, it was necessary to create embankments along the entire bottom. Then, the sea would be shallow, and navigation would still suffer. Cremo still intended to buy the treasure from Royd so that his visit would not be in vain. But the boy offered to make a deal. He knew how to install statues without embankments. Special supports were needed for that. To begin with, the young baron took a boat out to sea to explore the bottom. The water was icy, but it was necessary. Royd recognized that the bottom was pretty stable. When he surfaced, he saw Gabriel's satisfied smile. His face was burning, and he was laughing. Even though the knight didn't understand much of what the Lord was doing, his attitude was still condescending. They docked at the marina and were getting out of the boat when they suddenly noticed some people on the shore. Among them was a beautiful girl. She addressed the young baron, holding a letter in her hand. It was the Count's daughter. Her name was Christine. She smiled embarrassedly. Royd was confused. The girl shyly handed the letter to Gabriel, but not to him. The young baron froze, not knowing what to do. It was predictable because he didn't appear to be a nobleman and didn't take the time to act like one. The knight silently accepted the letter from Christine and cast a glance at his lord. The girl and her entourage ran away, and the young men stayed on the wharf. The guy called Gabriel a jerk in a frenzy and demanded an explanation. Azrahan looked questioningly at the young baron, not understanding why he was so angry. He wondered if Royd had never received a love letter. There was a whole range of bitter feelings in the young man's eyes, but envy was the strongest of them all. He ran to the mansion, where he came face to face with the Count. He asked what was wrong with him. He also reported that some of the necessary construction materials had been delivered except for the volcanic ash. It was the most essential ingredient in Roman cement. Only it could withstand the effects of wind and water for hundreds of years. For volcanic ash, you had to go where there were volcanoes, but such an expedition would take half a year. Royd had a backup for that. He knew roughly how to mix Portland cement. It was a modern type of mortar, but exact proportions were needed. They could only be calculated by experience. Having produced 129 unsuccessful samples, Royd still hadn't given up hope. His musings were interrupted by the phantoms that appeared. They asked for some attention from their master, but he was too busy. Kim So-hong remembered that in his other life, he had a pet dog. Unfortunately, he didn't pay much attention to it. When the pet went to the other side of the world, the man was deeply sorry. He hugged his phantoms and went for a walk with them. The little ones cheered up. Walking in the neighborhood of the mansion, the boy reflected on the fact that he had been too demanding. He sat down and thanked the mystical beings for their help. The phantoms sensed the sincerity in his words and sympathized with him. They accepted him into their family. The new possibilities of the Bell Snake were revealed. 500 experience points had to be spent. Royd figured it might be helpful in the current circumstances. The snake rose into the air and blinded the young man with a bright light. Among the new abilities was the ability to cause volcanic eruptions. The guy couldn't believe his eyes. This was precisely what he needed right now. The next day, a massive explosion occurred in the mountains near Cremo. People were terrified. This had never happened in their town before. It was Bell's generation of volcanic ash. Royd was testing a new method of extracting building materials. He turned happily to the knight to praise him for the idea. Gabriel's ears were blocked, so he couldn't hear the request. Then the young baron called him scary. The knight did not remain silent. He replied that he was not as fearsome as his master. The boy began to plot his next course of action enthusiastically. Bell was fitted with a giant diaper to filter volcanic ash. The eruption began. Observing all this, the Count marveled at the young Baron Frontera's knowledge. He was going to find out his secret and report it to the king. Such a talented boy shouldn't be stuck in some backwater. Royd was very pleased with Bell's work. So far, things have worked out very well for him. Then, they needed to build a dip well for cement. With the help of a winch, the well was set into the sea, and Ipo pumped the water out of it. Next, Gabriel drove the friction posts into the bottom of the well with a giant hammer. Royd was waiting for his catchphrase about how a noble knight shouldn't do construction. He had a prepared answer to that. They were doing a common cause that would help the barony pay its debts. Rod frames with steel projections were then installed in the well. At the very end, concrete was poured. When it hardened, the well could be removed. It was a support. The Count wasn't sure it could support the weight of the statue, but the young baron assured him that the column was powerful. If successful, Cremo promised a generous payment for the work of Royd and his men. By evening, the mermaid statue had been erected. A ball was held on the ship in honor of it. For the occasion, Royd had dressed up in a dress suit. He couldn't understand how Gabriel always wore such uncomfortable clothes. The Count introduced him to the guests as the most important person at the party. This was true, for he had made an invaluable contribution to the solution of the problem. The men hurried to pay their respects and express their gratitude to their savior. As expected, they approached Gabriel instead of Royd. Cremo laughed and said it was because of the young baron's face. He didn't appear to be a noble lord. The count informed those present that there had been a mistake, and they began to honor the real culprit of the occasion. A giant monster rose from the depths to the surface of the sea. Loud music and noise disturbed its peace. He saw the statue and became terribly angry. Mermaids had always been their blood enemies. The monster prepared to attack and swam up to where the ships were moored. The unsuspecting people continued to party. Gabriel stepped back with a glass of wine. Suddenly, he felt some movement in the water column. The knight peered into the depths. Royd came up and asked him what was the matter, and looked overboard as well. Azrahan replied that someone of a considerable size was rapidly approaching the ship. The young baron immediately realized who it might be and hurriedly informed the count. The boy advised to evacuate the people from the ship as soon as possible, but Cremo wanted to consult with his confidant, Mr. Ginevin. He didn't confirm Royd's fears. Knight Ginevin had good instincts, but Gabriel's were better. The count laughed and said that monsters don't swim that far, and there was nothing to fear. Here, the young baron guessed that the monster might have gotten angry because of the statue. At this moment, everyone felt the water surface beneath the ship shake. Even the statue moved. Cremo gave orders to raise the anchors and get the ships away from the statue as quickly as possible. The monster was already clearly visible in the sea. It was huge and scary. It was too late. Royd ordered Gabriel to cut the anchor without waiting to be hoisted. Azrahan dived into the icy water. He had to act quickly. At this time, the young baron summoned Podong and fed him red seed. The hamster increased in size and jumped on the statue. He chewed through the ropes that tied the ships to the statue. Under the water, the knight held his breath and cut the anchor chains one by one. A furious monster was rushing toward him. The ships managed to sail away in time because, in a few moments, the monster threw itself at the statue of the mermaid. The waves came up and swept over the ship. People fell into the sea, and Royd was thrown into the air. The sea titans smashed the statue to pieces. Pudong barely had time to jump into the water. Gabriel jumped out of the sea just in time to pick up his master and lower him to the bottom of the overturned ship. The impact sent shards of the statue flying across the city, destroying buildings. The knight and his master had to quickly figure out how to save the others. Royd summoned Ipo and ordered him to drink the seawater with the men. It was the only thing he could think of right now. At this time, the monster had gotten ashore and was already destroying the city. The knight shouted that they must somehow stop him, but the young baron was sailing the rest of the ship in a completely different direction. He was not going to fight the monster and advised Azrahan to flee. The astonished Gabriel froze in place. He had counted on his lord's nobility and had intended to deal with the danger together. The remaining ships picked up the survivors while panic broke out in the city. Gabriel urged the young baron to come back and help, but he shouted that he had come here to make money, not to risk his life. The knight could not believe his ears. All this time, he had watched his lord's heroic deeds, and his opinion was changing for the better. But now he was disappointed. His attitude toward Royd had deteriorated by 5 points. Azrahan decided he could handle it on his own, and without listening to his master's cries, he drew his sword. Using explosive power, he used a sword instead of a surfboard. He rushed towards the city where the defenses were already in place. Hundreds of cannonballs struck the monster but did not leave a scratch on it. Its body was covered with a hard shell. The monster's eyes burned with rage, emitting deadly force pulses. Gabriel arrived just in time to rescue the men. He used the technique of exploding power. The blow came right on the monster's claw, but didn't hurt it. It turned and attacked the knight, but he managed to dodge. But he had no weapon against the force field. Gabriel could not hold back the onslaught of such a powerful force. He was thrown back into the building and fell to the ground. Azrahan's goal was to distract the monster from the humans, and he succeeded. The knight was stalling so that the townsfolk could escape. Meanwhile, Royd sailed away from the city, comforting himself that he was powerless to help the unfortunates anyway. But his conscience was stronger. He felt sorry for the innocent people. Suddenly, it occurred to him that if the city were destroyed and its inhabitants died, he would not be paid for his work. The young baron immediately changed course and ordered Bell to use the volcanic eruption technique. They were heading back to the city. Gabriel could barely keep up with the monster's distraction. He managed to get close enough to it that he attacked its weakest point, its eye. Royd came up and threw a water-pumped hippo into the sea titan to make it turn toward him. He had a shovel in his hand, and his eyes burned with rage. He had returned to deal with the threat to his profits. Gabriel struck the monster's eyes again and again, but they remained unharmed. It had no weaknesses. The knight noticed the Lord coming to his aid. His presence gave him confidence. The young baron already had a plan, for while he had traveled here by land on the Podonga, he had been thinking about it all the way. He wondered why the beast was so invulnerable and what its shell was made of. Getting to a safe distance, he began scanning the sea titan. As it turned out, his armor was a meter thick of ivory. But that wasn't all. The energy of all Gabriel's blows was concentrated in one place. The monster's horn was his lightning rod. While the knight fought the enemy, Royd thought of how to cut off the horn. He advised Azrahan to combine all the mana circuits and release them through the sword. Gabriel put all his power into the blow and he succeeded. The beast made a shrill sound. It was wounded, but not defeated. The young baron ordered a strike, centered from tail to head. The knight continued the attack. At some point, he found himself under the monster's belly. Suddenly, the sea titan staggered and fell right where Gabriel stood. Royd cried out in horror. He couldn't believe what had happened. However, a second before that, Podong managed to dash over to Gabriel and take him out. The young baron rejoiced. He was very grateful to the phantom for saving his knight. After moving a safe distance away, Podong tried to say something to Gabriel, but he didn't understand him. The young man raised his sword and prepared to fight again. He believed that the master had a plan, and he certainly had one. Royd jumped on Podong and ordered him to run into the forest. He shouted to the knight to trap the beast. Soon, the phantom, along with the young baron on his back, disappeared among the trees. Even amid the disaster, the count was berating himself for his recklessness. He'd hoped to fix the trade situation, but he'd made it worse. Innocent people had suffered. He was on the ship when Royd sailed by, on the Bell. The young man said the monster's rage was only directed at the statue. Time had to be bought, and for that, the help of Count Cremo was needed. The boy shared his idea with him, and he rushed to Gabriel's aid himself. All this was before Royd reached the city. Now, the young men were leading the Sea Titan away from the humans. The knight couldn't fight anymore. He just ran with the rest of his strength. At that time, Podong appeared from somewhere. A gentleman was sitting on top of him, and a statue made of shards was in the cart behind him. They rushed towards the monster. The enraged Titan let out a loud roar. He was furious at the mermaid's mere sight. While the boys distracted him, Count Cremo and his men rebuilt the statue and placed it on a cart, to which they harnessed Podong. As Gabriel and Royd drew up, he asked his master to tell his plans in their entirety from now on. When the monster was occupied by the statue, the knight delivered a final crushing blow. The armor was pierced. The entire neighborhood shook with a powerful flash after Gabriel's deadly attack. But all that force was only enough to split the Titan's skin. The knight snapped and flew to the ground. He was disappointed in himself and his abilities. However, not all was lost. Royd entered the fray with his shovel. Gabriel thought that he would not survive after falling from such a height, but at the last moment, Ippo arrived in time to soften the blow. The young baron on Podong was himself unsure of success. He had never faced such a fast, invulnerable, and strong opponent before. Guy ordered Podong to stop and took off towards the behemoth on inertia. The only way to defeat it was to destroy it, as they had already exhausted all available means. Such a thought had come to him back when he'd gotten by sea on the Bell. Royd had hoped to harness the power of Azrahan's core, but he could only generate a double loop. Hanging on the monster's armor, the young man turned to Messenger to maximize his skill. He had enough experience points for only 9 levels. The young baron expected to use all available mana and dig into the Titan's open wound for all it was worth. At this time, Gabriel was coming to his senses, lying on the soft hippo. His sympathy for his master grew again. This added points to Royd, and he was able to improve the skill to level 10. He could now generate a triple loop around the mana core. He swung to strike. One circuit protected the core, and the other 2 were aimed at the enemy. Suddenly, the monster struck the rock with its claw. The impact shattered the rock into many shards. One of the large stones hit Royd right in the temple. He began to lose consciousness. Gathering the remnants of his mind, he concentrated and did irreparable damage to the monster. There was a massive explosion. The flaming monster was finally defeated. The people in the city heard the sound of the explosion. Hippobel and Podong leaned over the recovering Gabriel. He stood up and saw the lifeless body of the Sea Titan. How could he doubt his master, for he had done it? Little Podong was pulling the knight's finger excitedly somewhere. The young man got up and followed the mythical creatures. They led him to the lying Royd. There was horror on Gabriel's face. He ran over and listened to the young baron's heartbeat. His heart had stopped. A carrier pigeon was immediately sent to the barony of Frontera with a letter. He knocked on the window of Arcos's office, which was busy with important estate business. Count Cremo wrote that Royd Frontera completed a grand construction project, but during a natural disaster, sacrificed himself to save the people of the town. Unfortunately, in a battle with a sea monster, the young baron was injured and fell into a coma. Arcos was panic-stricken. He immediately jumped on his horse and rode with Bayern to Cremo. His heart pounded frantically with worry for his son. He scolded the boy 100 times for putting himself in danger. Manwha caught up with the riders in the forest. The Baroness was well in the saddle and could not stay away. There was a terrible snowstorm, but it didn't stop the excited parents from coming. Suddenly, there was a crunch of snow nearby. It crunched under someone's massive paws. The travelers stopped to listen. There were many dangers in the forests here. A massive wolf with burning eyes came toward them and blocked the way. It was the shortest way. Bayern advised the gentleman to seek a detour while he held off the monster. The wolf swung at the knight, but he managed to deflect the blow. It was his duty to protect his hosts. Driving away, the baron shouted to Bayern that they must hurry and would wait for him at Cremo. The knight was left alone to fight the monster, but his sword could not withstand and was broken by the mighty blow of a paw. The giant wolf clawed at Bayern's shoulder, but the man drew his blade and struck several blows at the ferocious face. The animal's jaws clenched harder from the pain, breaking the man's bones. Arcos heard a scream. He couldn't just leave one of his most loyal knights behind. When he came back, he attacked the wolf from behind with all his might. If it hadn't been for the baron, the knight would have been in trouble. And Baroness Merveille was not only trained in riding, but also in the use of weapons. It was she who slew the monster with a final sword strike to its eye. His opponent was defeated. His breathless body lay motionless, staining the snow a scarlet hue. Only Byrne was severely wounded. He lamented that he had put the master and mistress in danger. The baron helped him up. Merveille's excited cry made Arcos turn around. They saw a whole pack of the same wolves in front of them. There were at least a dozen of them. This meant imminent doom. Bayern limped over to the downed wolf and withdrew his blade from its cold body. He prepared to fight. The pack rushed at the humans, but the knight was going to defend the baron and baroness to the end. Arcos and Merveille froze in fear. They thought it was time to say goodbye to their lives. Suddenly, Gabriel appeared out of nowhere. The swordmaster had killed all the hungry wolves in an instant. As it turned out, he decided to move out of Cremo towards Royd's parents to guard them on the way. Bayern was pleased with Gabriel, but also surprised. He didn't understand how the young knight had managed to achieve such power in a short period. Azrahan asked if everyone was unharmed and if they could move on. Concerned parents first asked Gabriel about their son. The knight lowered his head and replied that he didn't know if his master was alive or not. He told me that when he found Royd, he was terrified, for if the young baron was gone, the estate would be ruined. Azrahan took his hand and felt for a pulse. He didn't understand how this was possible, for the young man's heart wasn't beating. The young man felt the mana inside the Lord. The triple loop was spinning at an incredible speed around the core. It was because of this that he was still alive. Now, it was clear how he could defeat the Sea Titan. Gabriel leaned over Royd and asked who he was, but of course, there was no answer. When the travelers arrived in Cremo, the city was slowly rebuilding after the devastation. Baron Arcos was horrified at the damage done. He couldn't believe that two young men could handle such a powerful monster. The knight said it was only because of Royd that they succeeded. He was the one who heroically saved the day. The young baron's parents overflowed with warmth and love for their son. He was no longer a mindless drunkard, but what had affected him, they did not know. At this time, the townspeople were gathering at Count Cremo's house. There, Royd Frontera was under the care of a doctor. People wanted to offer their help. Arcos listened to their conversation. He learned that his son had rescued victims from the icy sea and pulled them out of the rubble, and that the mythical creatures he summoned were helping to deal with the aftermath of the disaster. The people of Cremo owed Royd a debt of gratitude. Soon, a whole crowd of grateful people gathered outside the mansion. They all wished the young master well, but he had his detractors. Some thought that if the younger Frontera had not put the mermaid statue in the sea, nothing would have happened. However, proponents of such a view were quickly brought to their senses. The gratitude of all the people in the town earned Royd an incredible amount of experience points. He opened his eyes. His head was splitting. The last thing he remembered was using the triple circuit blast. Gabriel entered the room. He was amazed that his master was awake. The only thing Royd cared about now was getting paid for his work. He immediately asked the knight when they would receive the money. But even still, Azrahan was happy to see him alive and well. Following him, Arcos and Mervea ran into the room. They ran joyfully up to their son. They didn't care if it was their child or someone else in his guise. They were just grateful that he was safe. At this time, the Magenta Kingdom received a message from Count Cremo. He recounted the events in great detail and praised the young Baron Royd Frontera and his knight Gabriel Azrahan. It was, therefore, decided to send a message to the Barony of Frontera, inviting the young men to an audience. Queen Alicia Terramina Magentano was very interested in such uncommon personalities. Royd sat in the carriage and chatted with the messenger. His reputation had improved a lot lately, and he'd gotten bonus experience points for it. He also discovered a new skill. He could now concentrate mana in his heart. This feature saved the guy's life and increased his power. It was unique because it opened in him as a result of the explosion. Mana energy was akin to explosives. If you put a match to it, it would explode. But the heart of mana appeared in Royd's heart much later. It was the shockwave that triggered it to center in his heart. At last, the delayed Count Cremo got into the carriage, and they set off. Driving through the city, the boy looked at the ruined buildings. The streets had not yet been completely rebuilt after the monster's invasion. He asked how much money would be needed to rebuild the city. Cremo replied that it would cost more than a month's budget. The young baron continued that if the monster had not been defeated, it could have destroyed the entire city. Then, the cost would have exceeded the annual budget. The count didn't understand what he was getting at. Then, the young man hinted that Cremo had much more money at his disposal than he had paid him. After all, the guy only got paid for putting up the statue, but not for saving citizens. A distressed Cremo replied that he was ready to increase the reward by 1.5 times. He had nothing to object to. But Royd immediately said it was a misunderstanding, and he wasn't asking for money. However, he did discover how much the Earl valued the lives of his subjects. Cremo considered it an insult, so he promised to double the amount. But the young baron remained silent and stared boredly out of the window. It was only when the count had tripled the amount that the lad held out his hand to seal the contract. Cremo realized that this was the real extortion, but he was not disgusted with the guy. The townspeople idolized him. He became their idol. They chanted his name everywhere. Meanwhile, the carriage arrived at the square. Everyone had already gathered to hear what Royd Frontera had to say. The boy went up to the balcony and looked around at the crowd. He was worried about the number of people who had come. After all, they were potential clients. Touching the sound-amplifying ball, he began his speech. First, the young man asked if they had heard anything about the heating system. But of course, no one in these parts knew anything about it. In winter, everyone suffered from the cold. Children and old people were often sick. Royd started explaining to people that stoves and fireplaces take too much time and effort. He described all the charms of the heating system and insisted that it was needed in every home. The young baron ended his address by advising anyone interested to contact Frontera Manor. Count Cremo smirked as he listened to all this. He liked the young builder's business-like approach. That's why he wanted to make him his subordinate. The mission to Cremo was completed, and the Frontera family and their subjects returned home. Royd's mind was full of thoughts about the estate's reorganization. Knight Byrne was in charge while he was away. He saw Byrne's diligence and thought of making him a senior knight. But his fighting skills were rather average. But the knight was loyal and faithful. He excelled in his managerial duties. Byrne came to report to the young gentleman, telling him how the construction and mining of the coal were going. The boy interrupted him. He asked if Byrne alone controlled all of this. Answering in the affirmative, the knight explained that he was only following orders. At that time, a worker entered the room and reported that the construction of the last level of the heating system was finished and the work could be accepted. The young baron, along with the knight, went to check it out. Everything was executed perfectly. Byrne praised the workers, and Royd suddenly envisioned him in the modern world as a leader. It was absolutely necessary to reward such a worthy and honest man. For building the heating system at the Frontera estate, the boy received 400 experience points. While Royd was in Cremo, the Baron and Baroness took orders. In the meantime, the young Baron had begun building a coal storage facility. The trip to Cremo brought so much profit that the Baron was able to pay off half of his debt. The guy was looking forward to paying his bills in full and being able to deny himself nothing more. Gabriel, standing next to him, wanted to punch his master every time he saw his greedy face, but he had to restrain himself. The young men heard the signaling sound of a horn. It warned of the royal ambassador's visit. Royd was worried. He didn't understand why he had to send a messenger to such a backwater. A group of people, led by a very well-dressed man, rode up to them. He jumped down from his horse onto the red carpet prepared for him. Arcos, Mervea, and Royd bowed to the royal confidant. The ambassador began to read out the letter, and the guy was going over in his head the reasons why he was there. The point was that the young baron and his loyal knight had been invited to an audience in the kingdom. The baron was deeply touched by such an honor, and his level of sympathy for his son earned him 90 experience points. And the young man thought it was a bad sign. It meant that he had attracted too much attention with his activities. He's been in this situation before in the army. When Sergeant Kim Soo-hong was doing his job too well, he was given more and more responsibilities. The young baron regretted saving Cremo from the monster. He should have stopped to build support for the statue and escaped. It was impossible to refuse the queen, so Royd and Gabriel got into the carriage and set off. The knight noticed that his master was unhappy about something and asked what was wrong. The kid didn't answer, but he decided that if fate had it so, he should use the situation to his advantage. Soon the companions were in the palace and bowed before the queen's throne. Royd was embarrassed and excited. Queen Alicia Magentano was a beautiful, middle-aged, red-haired woman. She ordered them to rise. The boy stood up and greeted her with the kindest and most respectful words he knew. The woman was surprised to realize it was Royd Frontera. The woman was surprised to realize that he was Royd Frontera. Alicia stepped closer and felt the flow of unique mana inside the knight. The young baron was wary. This lady was no joke, for she could see right through him. The queen said she had heard about the young men's exploits from Count Cremo, but she preferred to see for herself rather than rely on rumors. The young people arrived at the palace on the royal road, so she asked what they thought needed renovation. Royd had read the novel and, therefore, knew exactly what was wrong. It was a trick question. His answer would determine whether or not a contract with the kingdom would be made, but he wasn't sure if it was necessary yet. It was said that the kingdom needed a new bridge over the Magena River. It was clear from Alicia's eyes that this was not the answer she had expected, but she asked him to tell her why he thought so. The young baron continued that perhaps the main building of the kingdom needed renovation. In ancient times, the palace tower was attacked twice by a dragon, so it was rebuilt. The roof was now flat and made the overall appearance worse by putting too much pressure on the supports. The queen was indignant, but didn't show it. She knew that he had guessed what answer was expected of him. Yet he had the nerve to mess with her head. Alicia realized the guy wasn't so simple either. He wasn't to be missed. The desire to make money overpowered, and Royd said he'd heard about the floods that were taking down the bridge for the 12th time. Annual repairs are time-consuming and costly. It is necessary to completely redesign the bridge. He asked to be entrusted with the job. The guy was going to build a suspension bridge using modern technology. The queen was outraged. How dare this redneck question the royal decisions? However, she didn't dislike him, but told him to keep talking. A joyful Royd began to explain the technology that would be used to build the new bridge, but Alicia quickly tired of it. She preferred action to words. The book states that in the future, she would be betrayed by someone in her inner circle and lose her hand, becoming the most bloodthirsty ruler. The queen asked what would happen if the new bridge also failed in the flood. The young baron gave his word that this would not happen. In return, he requested a decent salary to maintain his family's standard of living. Alicia said yes. The boy immediately handed her the contract. The confused woman asked if he didn't trust the king's word. Royd assured her that the treaty was to protect the rights of the kingdom. If he failed to honor the treaty, he would be punished. The queen immediately put her signature on the document. The satisfied boy bowed as low as he could. The vain young man was very proud of himself. But Gabriel looked at him judgmentally. The gentleman's rude behavior almost made Queen Alicia angry. However, she was impressed with his persistence. The ruler shared with her knight Kale that the boy was clever and calculating. He also has charm and immediately disposes of her even though he tries to fool her. A couple of days later, Royd was going to visit his younger brother, Julian, who was studying at the Royal Academy. The parents carefully gathered warm clothes for their youngest son and asked his older brother to give them to him. Guy hefted the sack on his back and ordered Gabriel to stay and wait for him in the palace. It pissed him off that wherever he appeared with the knight, all the female attention was on Azrahan. The young baron walked and recalled the events of the novel. In the story, due to the Frontera family's financial ruin, their youngest son was expelled from the academy. The poor guy wandered the streets at night until he stumbled upon the robber who took his life. But now he was safe. Royd went to meet the brother he'd never seen. Royd's brother was a skinny, red-haired teenager. He glared angrily at the young baron when they met, all because the relationship between the brothers didn't work out from the beginning. The boy had heard only insults from his older brother all his life and was kicked without reason. Royd threw a bag of clothes at Julian and was about to leave, but the system alerted him that the boy didn't trust him because of his overly kind demeanor. The young baron remembered that his mother had told him to spend time with Julian. she had asked him to dine with her at a restaurant. Then he turned around and called his brother a thug, asking if there was a restaurant nearby. He said he had. Royd took him to dinner, not forgetting the name-calling. The boy didn't recognize his brother. He was not accustomed to being treated so gently. When they arrived at the fancy restaurant, Julian wanted to order the simplest dish, but the guy let them order something more expensive. Their family was no longer in such dire need of money. 2 days ago, Julian learned of his older brother's exploits. He didn't believe the rumors, of course. Either it was a lie, or he had taken credit for Gabriel's accomplishments. Suddenly, an older student passed by and slapped the boy. It was because the Baron's family was poor and could not afford to eat in crowded places. Royd pondered what he should do. If he interfered, his younger brother might get in trouble. Guy saw the bruises on the boy's arm. So it's not the first time the poor guy's been beaten up. The abuser said his family has a rakanata recognized throughout the kingdom. This privilege enables him to occupy high positions. The young Baron had heard that word somewhere before. Rakanata. Rakona. That's the name of the vile Viscount who poisoned the water. Royd asked the bully what his father did for a living. He replied that his father was a wise and honest Viscount Raccoon who had achieved everything by his own labor. Ham asked who he was and if he was related to the ragamuffin. For this, he was immediately slapped. The blow was so decisive that the unfortunate man lost his teeth and flew to the other end of the hall. The disciples all around them got excited and rushed to their comrade's defense. Each of them got what they deserved. Even the strongest and most powerful sophomore, Cashpond, was left without teeth. The brothers, who called themselves the Double Horns of the Black Dragon, also came to stand up for Ham. They received this nickname due to their unique fighting technique. Royd scattered them apart so quickly that the guys didn't even have time to demonstrate their skills. No one else dared approach the Fronter brothers. Everyone was frightened and silent. Suddenly, the Viscount's son woke up and attacked Royd from behind. Diego Raccoon had accidentally broken the young Baron's nose in the scuffle. The next second, he was already regretting it. Frontera's face contorted into a devilish grimace. Royd was furious and began beating the Viscount's offspring. This went on until he begged for mercy. A frightened Julian thought his brother was crazy. He also thought he saw the vice principal here. That was a bad sign. Meanwhile, the young Baron continued the massacre. He asked Diego if he understood why he was being beaten and why he thought he was better than others. Suddenly, he felt his younger brother's hands on him. The boy tried to break up the fight. The boy asked if he was afraid he'd continue to be bullied. The older brother intended to take down the upstart. This frightened Julian very much. He did not wish anyone to die, not even his abuser. Kim Soo-hong learned a long time ago that the fear of losing one's life changes people. They rethink their actions. At that moment, the guards burst into the restaurant. They surrounded the troublemakers. The director of the Royal Academy shouted that disorderly conduct is akin to treason. Royd immediately turned to him and used the sweetest expression on his face. He gave his name and said he was Julian's brother. He also apologized for causing a commotion because he was only defending Her Highness's honor. At first, no one believed this explanation, but the boy said that his younger brother had suffered abuse from the scion of Viscount Racon. The vice principal witnessed the incident but took no action. This was because the heads of the academy were themselves noble people. The enraged principal questioned what all this had to do with the queen. Royd continued. The insult was directed at his brother and, therefore, at him. He pulled a special royal pass from his pocket and shoved it in the headmaster's face. Seeing the pass, the confused people immediately bowed to Royd. After saying that, the boy headed for the exit. The principal had a plan to punish Julian. The power of the royal pass applied only to the holder. As he left, Royd gave the headmaster a mad look. It was clear from the look on his face that if anything happened to his little brother, it would be bad for everyone. The brothers left the restaurant and headed for the administrative center. The boy was very angry with Royd. He shouted that because of this fight, he would not be allowed to live in peace at the academy. The young Baron advised him to start exercising. Muscles are best trained by physical labor. So they will now take a sabbatical for Julian, and he will go with his brother. Pretty soon, they were already in the royal palace. Royd, Gabriel, and Julian stayed in the rooms for honored guests. The knight urged the boy to listen to his brother's words. He confirmed that all the rumors about him were true. The teenager looked at him in surprise, unable to believe his ears. All this was heard by Royd, who was standing outside the door. He was proud of himself at that moment. Julian asked Gabriel if a person could change that much. The young man replied that he wasn't sure. Perhaps Royd wasn't the same person they had known. The guy at the door tensed up. He was in enough trouble as it was, and this was the last thing he needed. The boy assumed that someone was using his brother's body with black magic. The knight didn't rule out that possibility. Anything could happen in this world. Azrahan told the younger Frontera that he had tried to transfer Royd's soul into another body while he was in a coma, but it didn't work. It requires a considerable amount of mana. The young Baron was dumbfounded when he heard those words. Gabriel assured the boy that, at that moment, his master's soul and body were one. It was indeed his brother. It was a weight off Royd's shoulders. He needed these two as allies now, not enemies. But he immediately guessed that the knight probably sensed his presence, so he said he didn't suspect him of anything. Julian didn't know his family was in debt. All this time, he thought he was alone, trying hard to become a decent, educated man. But as it turned out, his older brother was trying for them all and ended up saving the estate. Julian's sympathy grew, but it was still negative. The door swung open, and Royd Frontera entered the room himself. He'd come to call his brother to his first practice. First, we had to prepare the cables for the bridge. The guy was showing how to pulverize the soil with a shovel. Then he added other breeds to it and fed this dish to Bell. Next came the smelting of steel. The Bell in his belly processed all these ingredients into an alloy. And when the steel cooled, Podong twisted the thin wires into strong ropes. That's how the ropes were made. Royd handed the shovel to his brother and told him to do it again. This was the most crucial step in his project. There were to be no mistakes. The excited Julian was initially confused, as he knew no construction techniques at all. His older brother encouraged him. He said a guy as innovative and responsible as him couldn't fail, but in the end, he still berated him. The boy didn't understand why his attitude was changing so much. Royd praised him, then called him names again. Building a suspension bridge in the absence of modern technology was a challenging task. The young Baron needed all the opportunities available in this world, so he went to the king's artisan. His name was Korhidas, but he chased him away as soon as he saw him on the doorstep of his house. He was a sturdy, elderly dwarf who enjoyed drinking alcohol. From the novel, the guy knew that a mean grandfather had to be really interested in his idea. Royd showed the plan for the bridge, but the dwarf interrupted him, saying he wasn't interested in human projects. But when Korhidas's gaze fell on the blueprints, a spark lit up in his eyes. He had never seen anything like it in his life. The crafty guy was already scrapping the plan and was going to look for another workshop. But the dwarf stopped him. He asked what would happen if the overall structure was not strong enough. If that happens, the structure will collapse. People would die, and Royd would lose his head. But if only Korhidas had taken the case, he would have helped avoid the deaths of hundreds of people. The dwarf was angry. He didn't tolerate threats against him, but the boy said he was only appealing to his conscience. Korhidas held out his hand to take a closer look at the blueprints. After studying them, he agreed to participate in the construction. In the entire kingdom, he was the only one who was excellent at designing and could calculate everything correctly. With a grimace of flattery, Royd managed to persuade the most competent specialist in the area to help him. At this time, Julian Bell and Podong were making ropes. The boy worked hard. In the king's workshop, the blacksmiths were making the planking for the bridge. Royd and Gabriel were busy building the central tower. Suddenly, their work was interrupted by a shout. The boys turned around and saw a whole army behind them. Their leader was outraged that they dared to squander the nation's wealth. The young baron was angry. Who could suspect him of dishonesty? It turned out that the royal engineers had made a complaint about it. They gave the queen the opinion that the bridge did not need to be replaced. According to them, Royd Frontera initiated the construction to secure the king's money. Queen Alicia summoned the young men and engineers to hear the arguments of both sides. Guild leader Victor said that the previous bridge had stood over the river for 30 years due to its wedge-shaped support. Yes, any structure needs repair sometimes, but the bridge is not so dilapidated that it can't be replaced with a new one. Royd remembered from the book that it was the time when the government and the rebels began their confrontation in the kingdom. The rainy season had come, and the bridge had been swept away by the floodwaters. Alicia asked Royd for his perspective, but he said that instead of the guild leader, he wanted to talk to the official sitting next to him. He questioned how much he had earned from buying the raw materials for the king's bridge. The official choked. He shouted that he was deeply offended by Royd's false accusations. But the young baron was no fool. He had observed money laundering in the modern world on numerous occasions. The queen said she still thought Frontera was a smart guy, but now he had made a fatal mistake. Royd tensed. He didn't like injustice, and now it smelled like it. Alicia sided with the royal officials because the young man had no evidence to support his claims. There was a trial coming up. The boy was tied up, and the executioner was brought in. He was ready to cut off the poor man's head. The woman approached Royd. She said that he had insulted not only the officials, but also herself. Gabriel stood in a daze, unsure of what to do. Pudong Bell and Ipo were with him. The young baron was given the floor. He said that a sinful man ruins his parents. The officials standing next to them did not care at all that someone would lose his life because of their fault. They were satisfied with the court's decision. The knight held his sword at the ready and was ready to enter the fray at any moment. However, the queen wanted to prove her subjects' innocence. Royd smirked. He was 100% sure that the case was dirty and the official wouldn't pass the test. The man was surrounded by court wizards. They were about to use a confession spell. The official panicked and begged me not to do it. He clearly had something to hide. The magicians put their ritual into action. They could not disobey the king's order. The young baron laughed, a devilish laugh, anticipating that the outcome of the case would be decided in his favor. Everyone discovered that Queen Alicia's subjects earned significantly more money from the bridge repairs than they should have. They were brought to a vacant lot. The cheaters were whipped and hanged from the poles. Royd begged such a punishment for them because he felt sorry for the cheaters' families. He was certainly angry that they had interfered with the bridge construction by taking up a lot of time, but he wasn't about to take their lives. The queen officially proclaimed the construction. All residents were to dedicate themselves to the construction and do their best. The royal magicians were not left out either. With the help of magic, the weight of the blocks for the construction of the tower was reduced, and it was quickly erected. Many people were watching. Everyone was interested in the result. The bellman stretched a metal cable from tower to tower. Pudong fastened the end of the cable to the opposite side. It remained to pull the other ropes in the same way, but from the main rope to the webbing. Julian was very proud of his older brother. He watched him work and grew to like him more and more. Gabriel praised the boy for his involvement in this as well. His help had become invaluable and crucial. He recalled that as a child, Julian had dreamed of learning to wield a sword, but his hands were too weak for a real weapon. Now, his muscles had become so strong that holding a sword was no longer a problem for him. When the cables were in place, Ipo, on his back, held parts of the webbing so he could secure them. At last, the work was completed. The young baron let out a cry of joy. For the construction, Royd received additional experience points. Now he had 3,019. The queen named the bridge after Gabriel Azrahan and Royd Frontera. He was also given the title of chief craftsman. The dwarf Corhitus considered the reward of the talented young man to be fair. The young baron rejoiced, for he had received so much money that it was enough to pay his entire debt. But there was one problem with all this. His title obliged him to serve the queen, and he planned to be rich and out of work. After the ceremony, Alicia immediately invited Royd to the palace to give him a new assignment. The young baron obeyed. He already had a plan to use his privilege to his advantage. The queen gathered all the advisors and nobles in the main hall and gave them a stern look. Royd and Gabriel knelt before her. She decided to grant the young baron new lands and a title, although she knew that the ambitious young man would be hard to please. The boy accepted the gift with honor and thanked the ruler for her kindness. He apologized for his desire to become a big man. The officials standing nearby were greatly embarrassed. They treated the village upstart with contempt. Among them was the academy's director. The young man continued that land and title would undoubtedly make him happier, but that was not what he was aiming for. Alicia wondered what the young man wanted so badly. She could fulfill his request. Royd told me that there was an outrage at the Royal Academy. He asked that the principal and deputy principal be removed. Students should not be segregated by influence, treating the less affluent worse than the wealthy. It was time to remind students that class inequality prevents peace from prevailing throughout the kingdom. The listeners froze, waiting to see what would happen next. No one had ever so boldly accused royal subjects as this young gentleman. Gabriel provided the queen with a scroll with testimonies from those affected by the class system. Alumni workers and one teacher confirmed these words. Here, the royal retinue could no longer remain silent. They began to accuse the boy of deceit and slander. But Queen Alicia Magentano was very clever and fair. She ordered those who spoke out to be subjected to a spell of confession. The magicians surrounded the suspects and applied magic to them, after which all their dark deeds were solved. Pretty soon, they were hanging on the pillars of shame, beaten and humiliated. The king was arriving at the castle, just as the guards were removing the last of the perpetrators of the atrocities. Royd and Gabriel watched it all from the hill. The shamed officials begged for mercy. The young baron cheered. He was always happy when someone got what they deserved, but there was another reason. He figured that now the king's sister would be busy cleaning up the government and would be out of Royd's hair. Then he could go back to his own country. But then their conversation was interrupted by the queen's knight. He brought a message from Her Majesty. The young people have been invited to a banquet to be held tomorrow night. She also relayed that using the Royal Academy to divert her attention was a great ploy. The boy realized that Her Highness could see through his thoughts. He felt uncomfortable. The Queen's knight withdrew. Royd reproached Gabriel for not warning him when their conversation was overheard. But Azrahan replied that Knight Kale was the best swordsman in the kingdom. He can go unnoticed when he needs to. In the royal suite, Julian asks his brother if he could have foreseen the sweep of the Academy leadership when he beat Diego Raccoon. Royd replied that he was sure the Queen was fair. The truth was on his side. That's easy for him. The boy said he was prouder of his older brother now than ever, and asked that the word lightness not be used. Little Julian opened his heart and honored Royd. For this, he was awarded experience points. They became 3,929. However, the young baron didn't give the appearance of being pleased. Instead, he said he was going to vomit at the words. It was time for the royal banquet. The decorated hall was filled with many people dressed up. Holding a glass of red drink in her hand, Queen Alicia called out to Royd. He was just trying to stay out of her sight and stealthily escape. Alicia compares the young baron to a bear that wants to slip away. Gabriel liked the comparison. He admired her insight and agreed with what she said. A disgruntled Royd glared at the shining knight. He only grinned. The Queen repeated for Frontera to approach her. He apologized for his slowness and approached her, but that didn't seem enough, and she ordered him to get as close as he could. He was embarrassed, but he dared not disobey. The distance between them was rapidly shrinking. The woman leaned down to his ear and whispered that he could come to her whenever he wanted, and then he would get whatever he wanted. Then she turned around and left, saying that this banquet was in their honor, so they could not deny themselves anything. Joyful Royd rubbed his hands together with pleasure. He was becoming increasingly influential. His imagination drew him bright prospects. In the future, he dreamed of not working and living happily ever after. He walked over to the table of food and began to greedily devour everything his hand could reach. Suddenly, he remembered that, in the novel, the Queen's downfall occurred 3 years later, after which she was forever changed. Behind Royd walked a royal knight and one of her subordinates. They dropped the phrase that the banquet would last until the moon waned. He'd heard that phrase somewhere before. Or rather, he'd read it. It was a secret signal for action. The Queen was going to be poisoned. But why now? And why that phrase was uttered by Kale? The boy had no answer. Queen Alicia lay down on the couch in her chambers. The woman was not feeling well from drinking. She was tired. The last few days had been filled with many events. A neighboring country is also preparing an attack on Magentano. The ruler of Isfahan has long claimed the rich and fertile land. Spies reported to the Queen that an army was gathering in the western part of the neighboring country, supposedly for exercises. However, it was too large an army for a drill. Alicia pondered over what Samarkand al-Ahinshad was up to. He was a cunning commander and had never lost a battle. The Queen's head was splitting. Her inner mana should have absorbed the alcohol from her blood long ago. The woman's heartbeat quickened. She couldn't concentrate on her thoughts. The power of her mana could heal the Queen by spinning, but her heart could not withstand such a strain. Ducking to the floor, Alicia let out a cry of despair. There was no one nearby. Suddenly it dawned on her that this could be what the poison was doing. It couldn't be because she'd carefully checked all her food and drink. The woman staggered toward the exit. She was panting and wanted to get some fresh air. The door to the chambers opened, and Kale entered the room. His face showed no emotion. The Queen reached out to him for help. She was grateful that he had come to her call. The knight said he was glad to be in the right place at the right time, but he wasn't going to help her. Instead, the traitor drew his sword. He intended to make the Queen sleep forever. The look of horror on Alicia's face. The person she thought was closest to her wanted to take her life. At that moment, Royd sensed something was wrong. He couldn't have any more fun at the banquet and ordered Gabriel to go with him. They headed for the Queen's chambers. The knight also felt a strange flow of mana. The Lord said that they would probably have to fight the kingdom's best swordmaster. They ran through the palace corridors and suddenly saw the breathless bodies of guards and servants. Someone had brutally massacred them. In the Queen's chambers, Kale and Alicia were in full swing. Even in her weakened state, the woman was fighting for her life. She wondered what had driven such a loyal knight to treason. The Queen's strength was fading. Kale swung to deliver the final blow. Gabriel burst into the room and struck the knight with a candlestick that came to hand. Azrahan and Kale confronted each other. The royal knight was strong, but his opponent was not inferior. Gabriel used a mana ring strike with a higher vibration. It was the most powerful technique available to him. Kale hadn't expected to be rebuffed. He was unfamiliar with such use of mana. The young knight struck another blow of the same strength. He didn't even need a sword to defeat the sword master. Royd ran up to the lying queen to see if she was all right. Alicia asked how they got here, but the guy covered her mouth with his hand. With his other hand, he placed it on her stomach to heal her with his mana. The battle between the knights continued. Neither of them was going to yield to the other. Knight Kale possessed a deadly aura sword technique. It was a technique that few could resist. Gabriel threw the candlestick at him, but he easily deflected the blow. The candelabrum spun in the air and returned like a boomerang to the young knight. He concentrated all available mana and put it into a ripping blow. His opponent was impressed, but he had more experience in fighting. He chopped the candlestick and wounded Gabriel in the process. The young baron was healing the queen and could not help his companion. The lives of everyone present now depended on Azrahan. For the traitor, now was the best moment to crush the young knight. The two men rushed toward each other, but Gabriel dodged the blow by summoning Podong. Phantom rushed to his aid, throwing Azrahan his sword. Now, the boy could fight back against the enemy with full force. Gabriel used a ripping blow and channeled its full power through his sword towards his opponent. It was a move the royal knight could not resist. The blow sent the man flying out of the room, shattering the doors. Azrahan used the power of mana as a cannonball. It was his personal invention. The young knight attacked again and again. Kale had no choice but to leave the scene. At this time, Royd was absorbing the poisoned mana from the queen's body. She was surprised how such a thing was even possible, but the young baron advised her to keep quiet so as not to distract him. Alicia was angry. No one ever told her what to do. Suddenly, Royd choked. His body was full of poison, and he began to bleed. The queen was perplexed. She saw how bad he was, and could not believe that he was sacrificing himself to save her. Hiding from Gabriel, Kale reached the hall where the banquet was still going on. People were scattering in panic at the sight of Azrahan's deadly attack. Despite his injury, the young knight pursued the villain to exact vengeance. Suddenly, Kale ordered the guards to surround Gabriel. He shouted that the young baron and his knight were attacking the queen. But Azrahan could not be intimidated by the guards, for he had once fought giant ants and a sea titan. The guy dashingly scattered the men coming at him in different directions. Seeing this, Kale marveled at Gabriel's abilities. With proper persistence, this young man could become the most powerful swordsman in the kingdom. The royal knight was once again ready to engage in battle. He once again used the sword aura technique. This time, an exhausted Gabriel couldn't resist him and flew off to the other end of the hall. Kyle walked over to look at the wounded body of the young man he had maimed himself. In the king's chambers, Royd was completing the absorption of the poison. His whole body was tense. He stood up and turned away. The queen called his name, but he did not answer. The poor man vomited. The poison came out of him as a thick black mass. Alicia advised him to concentrate the poison mana in one hand, or else he would die. The guy realized it was his only chance for salvation. That's precisely what she did in the book. She had to gather the mana in her hand and cut it off. Royd Frontera picked up a table knife and applied a ripping blow. The explosion was so powerful it blew a hole in the roof of the palace. Kale realized that it was Royd who was able to generate such a powerful mana discharge. The royal knight turned to Gabriel. The previously defeated boy had risen and was standing in front of him, holding a shard of sword in his hand. He couldn't renege on the vow he had once made to his master. Gabriel remembered sitting with Royd in the woods a few months ago. They had talked about the battle with the sea monster. The knight shared his anxiety with his master. He was scared from beginning to end. He was terrified when he realized he was alone. It's not right. He's too weak to be a knight. Even his master has reached the level of 3 mana circuits. So, for the rest of the year, Azrahan had to perfect his skills to continue to protect the young baron. The knight vowed that he would never again put Royd in danger or neglect his duties. Now was the time to prove your loyalty. Gabriel lunged at Kale. The royal knight pierced the boy through with his sword. Anyone else in his place would have fallen to pieces. However, it didn't inflict the expected damage on Azrahan. He still stood before the knight. His mana strengthened his body and made him less vulnerable. However, Kale had a trump card up his sleeve. The villain concentrated his mana into a sword and released it into Gabriel's body. The boy screamed in unbearable pain. He grabbed the man's arm and began to pull the sword out of his body. The deadly mana flowing through the sword was now hitting Kale himself. The man drew his own weapon to stop the mana absorption. Gabriel's breathless body collapsed in front of him. The knight felt no mana or heartbeat in the young man. Now, he intended to take the queen's head. Kale turned to leave, but suddenly heard a noise behind him. It was Gabriel Azrahan coming up. He was now the owner of the Swordmaster's mana. His sword aura was much more potent than Kale's. The man couldn't believe his eyes. A stream of indestructible energy rushed towards the royal knight. He tried to resist it by using his sword aura. However, his flow was not as strong. Kale could not withstand this fight and lost his arm. The guards came running to his heartbreaking scream and tried to help him in any way they could. But Gabriel forbade them to come close and threatened them with his sword. In the royal chambers, Alicia was trying to revive Royd. He'd passed out after the explosion and was showing no signs of life. The woman took his hand and tried to pass her mana to him. The queen could not lose such a talented human being. He could do the state a great deal of good. Suddenly, the guy opened his eyes. The system alerted him to his new skill. Now, the young man's body was resistant to poisons of any kind, but he could also absorb mana from the outside and feed on it when he was tired. Royd smiled broadly, but it was a strange smile. Alicia stared at him incomprehensibly. She was struggling with a mix of joy and annoyance. It didn't take long for the woman to hit the guy squarely in the forehead. Royd cried out in pain and stared at her. He didn't know what he'd done. The young baron asked why he had gotten hit on the head. The queen couldn't explain it, but she was very confused by his face. It was a spontaneous outburst of emotion. She inquired about his condition and wondered if he could stand up on his own. The young man had no strength left. His legs were still shaking from his ordeal. Then, he decided to try to absorb mana from the outside. Royd concentrated and he succeeded. He grabbed mana not only from around him, but also from the queen. Alicia was frightened. The woman asked him to stop, but the young baron didn't seem to hear her. Then, she stopped resisting. The queen was willing to give as much mana as he needed. Gabriel really needed his help right now. When Royd felt a surge of strength, he woke up. He was determined to save the world. The mana absorption had opened up new resources in him. The young baron was now a minor sword expert and could activate the berserk mode for 1 minute. His stamina had also increased. The boy jumped up to go to his knight's aid, but upon seeing the queen's condition, he hesitated. She was literally devastated. Royd had taken almost all of her life force. Alicia said they'd discuss it later, but for now, they needed to deal with Kale. She asked if the young baron could carry her. Of course, he could not refuse her request. Royd shouldered her and rushed to Gabriel Azrahan's aid. The queen was willing to share her mana with him as long as he defeated Kale. Arriving at the scene of the fight, they expected to see anything but the picture that unfolded before them. Standing in front was Gabriel, and in his hands was the sword of Aura. It was hard to believe. Nearby, a defeated Kale lay on the floor. He was severely wounded and screaming in pain. The queen ordered the guards advancing on Gabriel to lay down their weapons immediately. She explained that it was Kale who tried to take her life, and these two heroes stood up for her. The guards immediately paid their respects to the young men and retreated. Alicia had all the witnesses questioned at the banquet. Meanwhile, Royd asked Gabriel if he was really a swordsman now. The knight answered in the affirmative. From that moment on, he was able to protect his master from anything. That was the mission assigned to him by Baron Frontera. Royd was very pleased that everyone was unharmed and the villain defeated. By participating in such a large-scale event, a guy has discovered the ability to utilize the reward system. He had been awarded ridiculous titles for all the feats he had accomplished and was now eligible for title points. The system informed the young man that each title had gift effects, but the messenger refused to say what they were for. Royd begged him to reveal the secret, and Gabriel, passing by again, thought the gentleman had lost his mind. Finally, Messenger reported that by using extra title points, a person can gain absolute power against the laws of nature. The young baron was impressed. New opportunities were opening up before him. In the morning, Royd woke up in a state of disrepair. He was exhausted from the interrogations. He had to find out all of Kale's accomplices and neutralize them. Julian asked his brother about the results of the interrogations. And he said that they were using a spell of confession on all the witnesses, but nothing had been learned yet. While the proceedings were going on, Royd and Gabriel could not leave the kingdom. He pondered why the events of the future were happening now. Before, he could foresee them because he had read the novel. Now, there was uncertainty ahead. The boy asked where Gabriel was now. The young baron explained that the knight was in the queen's audience. He was now a master swordsman. Julian shouted in surprise, but the boy said there was nothing to be surprised about, or he wouldn't have defeated Kale. Then, the younger brother realized that since the royal knight was gone, someone must take his place. But why was Royd so calm? At this time, Gabriel bowed before the throne of the queen. She praised him for his past services. However, he had been invited for more than that. Alicia had ordered him to stay by her side from now on. Azrahan apologized to the queen for his rudeness, but he couldn't leave Baron Arcos Frontera behind. Queen Megentano was not used to hearing rejection. She likened refusal to serve her to treason, and treason in the kingdom was punishable by forfeiture. Then the young knight put his fate in the hands of Her Highness. He asked only for permission to write a farewell letter to the Baron. Alicia realized that the young man would rather part with his life than leave the Baron. She was a fair ruler, so she respected his will. Gabriel was released. As he walked back to his apartment, the knight heard Julian's voice behind him. When he turned around, he saw the teenager's eyes full of tears. The boy asked if Gabriel was leaving them. He couldn't believe it. Azrahan reassured him and told him he would forever be a knight of House Frontera. Julian's face shone with happiness. He loved Gabriel even more than his own brother. At this time, Royd Frontera was studying his titles, waiting for the midnight hour. The title points were due soon. Finally, he was awarded 22 points. They could be spent on a spoiler. The guy could see snippets of the future that would unfold in the final chapter. After a moment's thought, the young man pressed a button and put on his goggles. Everything around him turned black. The young baron was frightened, but then the blackness began to transform into houses and streets. It was the barony of Frontera, but it was not what Royd was used to seeing. It was ruined. There were lifeless bodies at every turn. Now, the boy was genuinely terrified. He ran down the street trying to find a single living soul. When he reached the Frontera mansion, he saw himself and Gabriel at the threshold. Their figures bent over the Baron and Baroness. They gave no sign of life. The other Royd was crying and lamenting that he hadn't arrived in time to protect his parents. Kim Soo-hong, in the guise of Royd, cried out in helplessness. He tried to call Messenger and find out why the novel ended this way, but the messenger still didn't appear. The guy stood alone in the middle of the ruined estate and did not know what to do next. Suddenly, he heard a humming sound. It was a strange, incomparable sound. The young man looked around. He saw a black cloud approaching. On closer inspection, however, it was billions of insects. Locusts were coming. Gabriel walked by and drew his sword, using his aura technique to disperse the pests. The hordes of insects seemed endless. They covered the entire sky. Even though the swordmaster bravely fought them, there were too many of them. Royd was gripped by panic. He who had defeated the giant ant and the sea titan was powerless against the swarm of locusts. And then it ended abruptly. The boy was back on the lawn outside the royal palace. He was shocked by what he saw. This could not be allowed to happen. The system confirmed that this was the possible future. The young baron ran to the palace to quickly report his vision to the queen. Alicia was attending to important state business when an agitated Royd burst into the office. He bowed to her and told her of the terrible locust infestation in the Cremona region. According to the young man, it was the act of the ruler of the neighboring country of Asfahan. He said that the king of Asfahan was very cunning, so he decided to weaken the enemy before attacking, specifically to attack the insects. It wasn't hard to do that by driving them out of their habitat. In search of food, the hordes went to new lands. However, in the book, this event was scheduled to take place 3.5 years later and in a very different location. The queen listened to Royd's words. It was very much like the truth. However, she rightly wondered how the guy knew all this. He hides too many secrets and behaves suspiciously. The young baron attributed it to his bloodline, which was tainted by the orcs. From them, he would allegedly learn what was happening throughout the West. He figured out Kale's treachery for himself. One day, he overheard the king's knight and the chamberlain exchanging a secret phrase and followed them. The mana absorption he was able to explain as well. His protector, Gabriel Azrahan, is the finest swordsman. The knight was always teaching the young baron what he knew. Alicia listened to the boy in disbelief. His story was good, but something made her uncomfortable. Royd decided to activate his title called Magentano the Fisherman. It gave absolute trust to the queen. It worked for him. The woman ordered 500 fighters and 50 mages to be assigned to the young baron. A satisfied Frontera thanked the ruler and exulted at how easily he had managed to convince her. But the queen said she was only doing it so that Royd would serve the kingdom. The guy assured her that if the insect hordes could be stopped, the ruler's authority would skyrocket. The woman was flattered. The young man was suspicious, but he had never let her down before. Royd and Gabriel got on their horses and sped down the road at full speed. They were going very fast, and the knight asked the lord where they were going so fast. The young baron replied that in 5 days they must be at the Frontier estate, or else there would be trouble. He hoped very much that Gabriel would be able to defeat a swarm of locusts. The knight had dealt with larger enemies before. However, these were not just insects, but fire locusts. They knew no fear, only hunger. Royd decided to drop Padong off halfway through. He had a cunning plan. He, along with the knight, rode directly through the river gorges and forests. There was not a moment to lose. After a couple of days, they reached the farm in the former swamp. The farmers were working in the fields when a small, dark cloud appeared in the distance. The boy already knew what it was. The riders came down to the plain and ordered the people to run and hide. But before that, Royd asked me to find him the biggest pot in the settlement. At this time, the locusts with burning eyes had already flown into the Frontera mansion, smashing the windows. Frightened servants tried to deal with the insects by nailing them with chairs. Unfortunately, it didn't work. The locusts kept coming and coming. Merveya took Emily's hand and led her away. They looked for a place to hide. The Baroness was horrified. In her entire life, she had never seen such an invasion. Baron Arcos jumped out of the study and rushed out with his sword to defend the women. They opened the doors of the mansion, but there was nowhere to run. The locusts had taken over the whole place. Bloodthirsty insects with burning eyes were destroying everything in their path. Byrne ran down the street, trying to gather an army at the door of the Baron's mansion. He did not know how the army should fight the locusts. Winged monsters attacked people and animals. They didn't care who they bit. Byrne remembered the most important order of Arcos. If disaster came to their land, the first thing to do was to save the inhabitants. So, he began to drive the locusts away from the people. The orcs also came out to fight the flying monsters. They gathered at the Baron's house and held back the onslaught. But even the orcs could not defend themselves indefinitely. Insects bit through their thick skin, leaving deep wounds. One of the orcs covered little Emily, trembling with her body. Suddenly, they heard a familiar voice amidst the rumble. Royd was shouting, drawing the locust's attention back to himself. In the young Baron's hand was a huge pot, and Gabriel was striking it with his sword. The locusts changed course and headed in their direction. The people of the Frontera estate saw clear skies overhead. Baron Arcos and Baroness Merveil recognized their son's voice at once. It was their Royd. The young lord and the knight galloped off, taking the insects to the outskirts. Azrohan continued to beat on the pot. Whether on purpose or not, he struck so that the edge of the dish towel flew into the gentleman's face. The knight was amused by this and couldn't hold back a smile for which he received a name-calling. Royd was on his way to Raccoon Manor. That was his plan. He was going to lure the locusts onto the evil Viscount's land. At first, Gabriel thought the Lord wanted to lead the horde further away, thus saving the neighboring territory. His sympathy grew a little, but the young Baron wasn't about to save the one who had nearly ruined Royd and his family. The locusts had already approached Raycon's estate. His luxurious mansion was swallowed by a dark cloud. The unfortunate Viscount was running away from the flying monsters without knowing where to hide. Suddenly, Royd and Gabriel, on horseback, burst into the manor. The Viscount shouted in surprise. He hadn't expected to see the young Baron here at all. The guy yelled at him not to even count on deferring payment on the debt, despite the losses. The young men continued to beat the sword against the pot, taking the insects further away. Gabriel asked his master if he had deliberately lured the locusts indoors to pile up. Royd laughed his devilish laugh that infuriated the knight. Azrahan only confirmed that his master was a madman. They continued at full speed, making a lot of noise. The young Baron said something about making loud noises, but Gabriel couldn't understand why they were doing it. Meanwhile, they led the insect cloud away from populated areas. We should have gone back to the Mares swamps, but there seemed to be even more locusts. Gabriel advised the gentleman to cover himself with a pot, and then he rode ahead. Using his sword aura, he began to clear the way. The defeated flying monsters fell to the ground with an unpleasant sound. Bit by bit, Royd and Gabriel made their way back to the farm on the former swamp. They managed to combine the two locust clouds into a single, massive cloud. The young gentleman's horse was exhausted and could no longer continue on its way. Discarding the unnecessary dishes, Royd ordered the knight to prepare his back. He took the phrase as a joke at first. In one leap, the boy moved from his horse onto the back of a stunned Gabriel. Wrapping his arms and legs around the swordmaster, the young Baron ordered him to get off his horse and run. But of course, Gabriel, with such a heavy burden on his back, could not run faster than a horse. At this point, Royd called upon his phantoms, Belle and Ipo, for help. They were already waiting for their host in the river that blocked the way ahead. The boys threw themselves into the water and covered their heads with their hands. The bellmen prepared to spew volcanic ash. A giant stream of fire burst from the bell towards the locusts. Incredibly, the fire locust itself was afraid of fire. People in the barony of Frontera watched the insects turn to ash before their eyes. Hippo entered the fray next. He stopped the flying buggers with a powerful force of water. It was up to Gabriel and Royd to finish the job. They both used the sword aura technique. The dual mana energy possessed destructive power. Locust didn't stand a chance. When the lifeless bodies of the insects covered the ground and the sky was blue again, the boys were able to catch their breath. Gabriel told Royd that although they had dealt with most of the pests, not all of them had died. Some of them could hide in the dwellings and continue to do damage. But Royd was calm. He had a trump card up his sleeve in the form of Podong. Releasing the Phantom, the Lord told him to run to the Steel Sandorc village for help. Podong was already on his way to the Frontera lands with an army of 300 elite fighters. Royal warriors and mages sent by Alicia Magentano rushed to their aid. However, the young baron was sure that this would not be the end of it. The ruler of Isfahan had just begun his offensive. The leader of the royal knights gave orders to exterminate every single pest. The wizards used an extermination spell against the remaining locusts. The orcs fought with their usual weapons. The numerical advantage was on their side. For them, locusts were also a great source of protein. Even in battle, they did not forget to think about their muscles. The manor was in the process of counting its losses and cleaning up broken utensils. Emily decided to thank the orc who had protected her. She solemnly handed the guy a flower as a token of her appreciation. The young orc accepted the gift, and the embarrassed girl hid in the mansion. Arcos and Merveia ran up to Royd, who was resting on the grass. They wanted to make sure their son was all right. The boy was unharmed. The parents tearfully rushed to hug him and thank him for the rescue. They were excited and proud of their boy. Royd didn't bother to tell them that he was only trying for his own livelihood and didn't care about the well-being of the others. Thanks to this event, the guy earned a new title, Insect Headhunter. Now, he could intimidate any insect with a mere glance. At night, the young baron stepped out into the riffle ring next to the Frontera mansion. He was approached by the leader of the king's warriors, whom he had called here beforehand. His name was Valerati Blanc. The boy began by thanking the commander for his help. However, he rightly noted that the young gentleman had taken the brunt of the attack. Valerati had never taken the young man seriously before. He thought him incompetent in the military, but now his opinion has changed. The man recognized in Royd as an excellent strategist and talented organizer. But at the same time, he didn't like the guy. He said it to his face because he was never a hypocrite. Blank wondered why he had been summoned at such a late hour. Royd knew from the novel that the man was eternally devoted to his queen. He was literally willing to do anything for her, even massacre her. In the story, Valerati was supposed to fight Gabriel and fall in that fight. On his way out, he asked Azrahan to stop the queen. The young baron realized that there was no way to outwit the shrewd commander, so he decided to propose a bet. The young man asked the man to fight him. If Royd won, Blank would have to join his construction crew. And suppose the victory is on the side of the warrior. In that case, he and his army will immediately return to the kingdom. Valerati laughed. He replied that he could not fight a mere man. But Royd reminded him that the queen had entrusted him with the command of the army, so he was also in some way a commander. The boy ordered the warrior to fight. This infuriated the royal warrior. The boy insisted on a fair fight. He was sure that the commander would prefer to leave this land with dignity. The man relented. He asked if the young man had any weapons. Royd raised his shovel, which had saved him many times, but he wasn't quite sure of his victory. Even with a triple mana circuit, the guy was weaker than the royal commander because of his mastery of the sword. Valerati suggested changing the tournament's rules. He said that if even one of Royd's attacks moved him, the young baron would win. A pleased Royd agreed. He should have been strong enough to do that. The guy used a triple blast attack and put the full power of his mana into the shovel. The fire pulse flew straight into the top of a neighboring mountain. The blast wave threw the commander several meters through the air. He looked at the ruined mountain in horror. An enormous crater adorned the summit. Valerati turned around and saw Royd lying on the ground. The blast had been so devastating that he'd flown off to the side. The guy was fine. He laughed, enjoying his victory. He now had 500 elite warriors at his disposal. The royal army reclassified as a construction crew and did the digging. The soldiers were not happy about it, but there was nothing they could do about it. The commander was a man of honor who always kept his word. After the fight, Royd said one thing to him. Swinging a shovel can be much more honorable than swinging a sword. But that wasn't the only reason why Valerati was at the construction site. He wanted to understand what the young baron was up to. Meanwhile, Royd and Gabriel stood on the edge of the cliff, gazing into the distance. The knight asked if the lord was sure his plan would work. The boy was sure, of course, as he always was. He was going to defend his lands using a method learned from the orcs. The outline of some horrible monster was clearly visible in the rock. All the while, Royd was preparing for a new attack on Frontera Manor. According to the plot of the book, the next move of the ruler of Asfahan was to attack the mastodons. They were powerful and ferocious animals, sweeping everything in their path away. You could feel their approach long before they came into view. People hid in terror in their dwellings, afraid to show their faces in the street. The ground shook with the heavy hoofbeats. Standing on top of the mountain, Royd waited. The lives of many innocent people were in his hands. The man brought with him 2 flags, one white and one blue. He needed them to signal. The royal soldiers, led by Valerati, were concentrated at the entrance to the manor. It was exactly as the young baron had told him. At first, the man didn't believe the young man and demanded proof, but Royd was able to convince him. Together, they devised a plan to intercept the herd of mastodons. First, they must neutralize those at the head of the convoy. Then, surround the rest and attack. The royal army may have suffered severe losses, but no one was going to retreat. Suddenly, the royal commander noticed Knight Byron beside him. The young master had sent him to translate his signals. Valerati looked toward the mountains and saw Royd there with 2 flags. Finally, the guy signaled the offensive by manipulating the flags. He ordered them to move to the south of the village. The commander was taken aback. This meant that the monsters would have a direct route to the village. Royd repeated the signals. He urged the warriors to do as they were told in the queen's name. Byron translated the warlord's appeal and assured him that everything was planned initially. Meanwhile, the mastodons were advancing. The loss of precious minutes could have been fatal. The herd rushed past Royd, straight to the rock in which the monstrous silhouette had been carved. It was the image of a megalomania lizard. The mastodons braked in front of the rock, knocking each other down. When they saw their sworn enemy in the rock, they scattered. The royal army was the next to enter the battle. The warriors trotted their horses to kick up as much dust as possible and crossed their lances. The horse stomping made the monsters think that a herd of giant lizards was heading this way. As Royd had expected, they moved south in a panic. A trench dug by the king's soldiers was waiting for them. Hippo was entrusted to complete the mission. At his master's signal, he filled the entire trench with water. Mastodons were large and clumsy animals, so they were unable to swim. They were simply swept away by the current. Royd's mission to save humanity was complete. With a sense of accomplishment, he tossed the flags aside. The situation was tense, but now that the mastodons have made their way to the shore downstream, they have found excellent pasture here. Valerati looked at them and said that severe losses had been avoided, but the loss of 5 fighters was still a blow. Every one of them was valuable. Royd nodded, realizing that battle leaves its marks even when victory comes without a fight. The commander asked him if the canal was part of the plan, but the boy replied that he had not planned it from the beginning. The idea to use the channel came spontaneously. The companions kneeling before the unfortunate mother handed over her son's spear with deep respect. "He died honorably fighting for the queen and our common goal," said one of the fighters, trying to comfort her grief. Tears rolled down his mother's cheeks as she sobbingly accepted this testament to his bravery. As the commander watched, he felt the weight of loss weighing on his shoulders. He realized that each of these men was not just a soldier, but part of a family. Losing his friends was unbearable, and he knew he had to find a way for them to keep moving forward. The training had to continue. It was a duty to those who gave their lives. The warriors had to be stronger so that the sacrifice would not be in vain. The fighters agreed, realizing that now, more than ever, they needed to unite. They left the burial site. It started to rain, but Valerati himself didn't go anywhere. He sat and thought about what had happened. The commander sat in the cold rain that poured down mercilessly on his head, mixed with the tears that rolled down his cheeks. The words of honor and bravery he had spoken now seemed empty and irrelevant to him. Doom left behind only hell, the pain of loss, and a sense of powerlessness. He remembered Olga's face as he shared the happy news of the upcoming wedding. Everyone had laughed and congratulated him, full of hope for a bright future. Now Olgi lay in the ground, his dreams and plans forever unfulfilled. Valerati could feel the deep rage and bitterness growing inside him. Gabriel reminded Royd of his words that the animal attacks would not stop. He replied that it would end at some point, but there would be a few waves before that. The knight said every attack causes irreparable damage. We need to figure out a way to stop it. The young baron agreed. That's what he was doing now. A new strategy was being developed. Azrahan suggested that it might be a good idea to attack the monsters with as little force as possible. Use cunning and dexterity to minimize casualties. Valerati, standing nearby, heard their conversation and came closer. He offered the help of his fighters with determination. They will write a letter to the queen, asking her to stay and help. The warrior had seen real victory. and now realized he was a poor commander. The boys looked at each other in surprise, not expecting such frankness. The man knelt down on one knee and bowed his head before them. His fighters, inspired by the commander's words, did the same, kneeling as a sign of respect and support. Royd, surprised at his decision, agreed. He said he was going to live up to the legend this time. It's a considerable risk. At Frontera Manor, all the key figures were gathered around a large table. Valerati Commander Royd Gabriel and the Baron and Baroness. The young Baron began to reminisce about the past. He reminded his father how he had opposed the idea of a waterway from Lake Capua. The Baron frowned and nodded. It was his way of warning you of the risks. Legend had it that the lake was home to an ancient monster. The son had promised then that he wouldn't disturb the monster, but now he intended to do just that. Arcos did not hold back his anger and shouted that he was against it. It was madness. They should have thought of the safety of the people. Merway, sitting next to her, supported her husband. No one knew what would happen if they woke the thing. Royd felt a surge of confidence as he felt the support of Valerati and Gabriel. He said they must act immediately. The Baron, however, was not going to give up. He did not have to agree, but those present left him no choice but to do so. Arcos crossed his arms over his chest in displeasure. The boy was glad that the new plan had been approved and enthusiastically started to implement it. He ordered the men to assemble and get started. They were soon joined by workers ready to support the endeavor. Gabriel, overseeing Royd, asked if he wanted to awaken the monster to control it. Royd shook his head. It was impossible. The young man had studied many sources, but he had found no evidence of a monster attacking humans anywhere. It lives in a lake, and there is its nest. If it is destroyed, the monster will roar and build a new one. But that is the strategy. The monster will rebuild its nest, but it will be destroyed again, and so on, ad infinitum. This will give us time to prepare for the next stage. The young Baron smiled unpleasantly. His plan seemed both daring and risky, but he felt it was the only way out. Every time the nest is destroyed, the monster will roar with anger, which Royd thought would deter other monsters from threatening them. Gabriel listened to this with a look of disbelief. What if the situation got out of control and the beast attacked after all? The young Baron replied without losing confidence that then the knight would go and deal with him, and then he would scare everyone away with his growl instead. Azrahan asked irritably if the Lord considered him a dog. He couldn't believe that Royd could speak so lightly about such a serious situation. The young men stood on the shore of the lake, and the Baron's son began to visualize the blueprint. He gazed into the water, imagining what their actions would look like. Royd was in deep analysis mode, figuring out where best to start destroying the nest to avoid flooding. He made passes in the air with his hands, drawing a plan that only he could see. Gabriel, watching him, didn't understand what was going on, and looked at Valerati in bewilderment. The knight explained, trying to justify Royd's actions, that he wasn't crazy, just had his own methods. Valerati realized that sometimes an unconventional approach could lead to unexpected successes, and perhaps that was what was helping Royd right now. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the lake, the monster sensed the approach of the humans. His fur fluffed up, and he listened to the sounds coming from the surface. As he walked along the road, Royd noticed Byrne frolicking with the mastodon cubs in the pen. They were jumping and playing merrily, and Byrne was laughing. The young Baron stopped watching this scene, and his face became serious. The knight noticed him and came closer with a smile on his face, saying that these cubs had lost their mother and he would like to keep them. The guy, still not believing his ears, replied that it could be dangerous. Mastodons are wild animals, and their behavior is unpredictable. Byron would not back down and insisted that they were adorable. The rugged man felt he could raise them and make them loyal companions. Royd looked incredulously at Byrne, who seemed absorbed in playing with the mastodon cubs. Finally, he waved his hand and agreed. The knight was pleased and continued to frolic. The boy left thinking, if these little ones could be tamed, they might be helpful in the future. At that time, the orcs left Frontera Manor. They spoke of the potential threat from the monsters and the need to protect their people. The young Baron, realizing the importance of their decision, let them go, sending with them 5 volunteers from the royal detachment to provide backup. Returning to his business, the lad met with Valerati, who reported on the readiness for the operation. Royd was glad, and his heart beat faster. He raised his head and looked at his comrades, proclaiming that today they would awaken the legendary beast. His voice sounded confident and inspiring as he talked about the upcoming surgery. The young man, sensing the growing tension and anticipation among the royal warriors, tried to raise their morale. Gabriel stood a little to the side and watched in silence. His heart was heavy with foreboding. He sympathized with the warriors, knowing that something dangerous and unpredictable lay ahead of them. Using the simulation mode, Royd scrutinized his plan and found a way to avoid the flood. Every decision had to be considered. Gabriel stood on the hill, watching as the Lord actively coordinated the actions of his team. He asked Gabriel if he could see the markings. Gabriel squinted at Royd's instructions. He answered that he could see. His voice was full of determination. Royd gave the order to proceed. He was excited for the turning point. Gabriel concentrated on gathering his magical power. He used a technique known as mana explosion. There was a loud crack, and a small break in the ground was formed. Although the damage was minor, it was enough to compromise the dam's integrity. Water began to rush out through the resulting crack, creating a powerful flow that sought to release the lake from its overpressure. Royd and his warriors lay on the ground waiting for the outcome. He knew the consequences of breaking the dam could be unpredictable. There was an island-like nest in the middle of the lake, and suddenly it split open. Royd gritted his teeth and watched tensely to see what would happen next. Suddenly, something rose into the air from the bottom of the lake. Gabriel and Valerati stood breathless. They had never seen anything like it. A massive column of water surged upward as if nature itself was reacting to the destruction of the nest. The monster awakened from its slumber with a deafening roar. A giant beaver appeared before them, and Royd was surprised. It was not what he had expected. It was a cute animal, though its size was impressive. The beaver, who looked like a mythical creature, let out muffled growls full of anger and displeasure. The young baron, still shocked, tried to comprehend the situation. Their plan had worked. The beaver was clearly angry because they had destroyed his home. The animal looked around. It began to approach the tree where Royd was hiding, and at that moment, it smelled a human odor. His anger at the people only increased. Did they really think he would just rebuild his dam and go back to a quiet life? Royd, realizing that the beaver was smarter than he thought, felt panic overwhelm him. Their plan was going to fail. He glanced at the warriors who were waiting for orders. Royd's face was horrified because he had no plan to save them. At that moment, the giant, enraged and full of determination, raised a wave in the lake. The water rose, and suddenly, a tsunami slammed into the shore where the people were hiding. The water overwhelmed the men, and panic set in. Gabriel, seeing his comrades struggling for air, soared upward using his magical powers. He gathered all his strength and, focusing his attention on the giant beaver, released a powerful blast of mana. A stream of energy rushed towards the monster, but it was unimpressed and simply swung away from the blow with its mighty paw. Gabriel, realizing that his first approach wasn't working, decided to use his sword aura. He prepared to deliver a devastating blow, and his eyes lit up. But at that moment, Royd ordered the knight to stop. Gabriel froze, and his attention shifted to Royd. The young baron had an epiphany. If the beaver was a creature like Podong or Hippo, it could be stopped. Gabriel, realizing that time was playing against them, began to distract the beaver. He flew around it using the power of mana. The beaver just waved him away. Meanwhile, Royd lurked, watching the situation from a safe distance. The animal's senses were excellent, and it quickly detected Royd's movements. Suddenly, the giant turned towards him, and the guy, realizing he had been spotted, instantly dove under the water, trying to hide from the monster's gaze. The knight continued to distract the beaver and used restrained attacks, trying not to injure it. He realized that strong blows could only aggravate the situation. Instead, he used light bursts of mana that could only be slightly annoying and distracting. Gathering as much air into his lungs as he could, Gabriel screamed with all his might. Valerity and his soldiers lurked in the tall grass, watching with hope and anxiety. Gabriel, however, wasted no time in imitating the beaver's language in an attempt to establish contact. But his words, though spoken with enthusiasm, made no sense when translated into beaver. Beaver wrinkled his forehead in bewilderment, clearly not understanding what was going on, and his anger was only growing. At that moment, Royd took advantage of the distraction to swim up to the giant and deftly climb up his fur on his head. The beaver was angry, but his short paws couldn't reach the guy who, balancing on his head, started to act up. The young baron gathered his strength, jumped up, and threw a sunflower seed into the animal's mouth. The beaver, not expecting such impudence, swallowed the seed, and at that moment, something amazing happened. The giant, which seemed fierce and intimidating, suddenly began to shrink. Royd, watching the process, realized that the phantom before them was indeed a phantom. The young baron rejoiced. His hunch was correct, and the situation was resolved. The animal was panicked and confused. Still unaware of what was happening, the terrifying monster transformed into a cute little baby. The boy took it in his hands. Royd's face twisted into a grin of satisfaction. However, joy was quickly replaced by wariness when the beaver began to break free from his grasp. With a mighty jerk and fury, the beaver slapped Royd in the face with his tail, making him recoil. He started to run away, feeling a sense of freedom. The soldiers and Valorati saw the beaver trying to escape and rushed in pursuit. The creature was fast and agile despite its size. Royd, realizing the situation might get out of hand, summoned his phantoms. They appeared out of nowhere like shadows, always ready to help him. Podong noticed that the beaver was trying to escape and blocked his path. The beaver did not want to give up and hit Podong, for which he was punched back. They began to pound each other. There were sounds of clashing and rustling in the air. At this time, Ipo jumped on top of them, trying to intervene in the conflict, but the beaver recoiled to the side. Hippo swooped down on Podong, adding to the chaos of this already difficult situation. The animal took advantage of the moment and ran toward Royd, aiming to get between his legs. However, a bell snake was behind the guy, and upon seeing it, the beaver suddenly stopped. He froze, as if mesmerized, and stared at the snake. Their gazes met, and at that moment, an unusual connection was formed between them. Beaver, forgetting about the conflict, found himself captivated by the charms of this amazing snake. The young baron, watching this scene, quickly oriented himself. He squatted down and turned to the beaver and offered to negotiate. The animal was still staring at the snake as if it had realized that, at this moment, it had the power to change the situation. The guy, feeling that he had captured the horrible ancient monster, smiled devilishly. Now, he had a chance to make contact and tame the creature. At the Frontera mansion, Royd and his phantoms continued to make contact with the beaver, who was still wary but ready to listen. Royd explained that he had to growl 3 times a day to maintain peace and friendship with the humans. The beast snorted and replied that Royd didn't know anything about negotiation and had to offer something in return. He wasn't going to just give in. The young baron hesitated. He had nothing to offer, but he quickly gathered his thoughts and said that if he agreed, the beaver would please the snake very much. Belle, being close to the beaver, glowed, and her eyes filled with curiosity. She instinctively felt that the situation was improving. Beaver was speechless, his eyes filled with wonder and tenderness as he looked at the snake. He would do anything for her mesmerizing eyes. Royd watched the scene and rejoiced in his success. He was able to fool the beaver, and at that moment, he felt amused at the creature's naive love. Deep down, however, the boy had mixed feelings. Although Royd laughed at the beaver's naivete, he had no experience in love and relationships. In this animal, he suddenly felt a kindred spirit. He supposed that the beaver's understanding of love and friendship was much more sincere than his own. Beaver accepted the young man's embrace and found comfort in the gesture. He couldn't quite realize that his feelings were unrequited. Now they stood in each other's arms, and this strange connection seemed like something important to both of them. The sergeant who had been sent to the orc village burst into the office. His face was contorted with anxiety and fatigue. He shouted that they had met an orc on the way to get reinforcements. The orc settlement was attacked by a herd of Megalanians. The sergeant puffed up as he continued. The orcs fought as hard as they could, but the Megalanians were stronger. Many fighters fell in the unequal battle. Royd, clutching the beaver in his hand, quickly assessed the situation. He knew time was not on their side. We had to act immediately. The young baron ordered the royal army to move to help the orcs. The sergeant lamented that they might not make it in time. The lord and his knight rushed towards the exit. Royd said it was their chance to finally stop the monsters from attacking the manor. He took out a sunflower seed, leaned over to the beaver, and fed it. At the exact moment, the beaver began to grow in size. His body began to grow and enlarge until he became a giant, yet friendly creature. The humans watching the transformation were frightened and backed away. Still, Royd and Gabriel were already clinging to the beaver's fur in preparation for the unusual journey. The beast galloped down the mountain. Its powerful paws easily overcame obstacles. A young baron knight and soldiers rode on it. All of them were determined and expected to meet the orcs soon. Beaver moved quickly and confidently. Soon, they reached the orc village. The orcs fighting the Megalania were confused when they saw the giant beaver rushing towards them. They didn't understand what was happening. The Megalanians were also frightened when they saw the approaching beast. Its impressive size and power made it a threat. Royd, realizing that the time had come, told the beaver to tell the megalomaniacs not to move westward under any circumstances. Otherwise, they'd be in trouble. The giant, realizing his role, let out a mighty roar that echoed around the area. His voice was full of power and confidence. The Megalanians heard this sound and froze. Beaver scattered the megalomania to the sides, using his strength and power. The lizards were like fluff to him. The megalanias fell into the thick thickets and disappeared from sight. Beaver had won, and there were shouts of joy in the orc village. The bell snake nearby looked at the beaver with gratitude. Thinking there was nothing more to do here, Valerity asked Royd if they could go back. The young baron replied that there was something else they had come here for. At that moment, the orc chieftain of the orcs, Akuche, approached the boy. His expression was serious. Royd saw that and asked if he was all right. Akuche held back emotion and said that orcs are no longer allies to humans. This statement shocked Royd, Gabriel, and Valerity. They exchanged surprised glances, not understanding what could have led to such a decision. But then the crowd of orcs gathered around continued. The young baron had saved them twice. The orcs swore allegiance to the Frontier family. Royd smiled in satisfaction at this twist. It was precisely what he needed. The next phase of the mission to save the orcs could begin. Recently, the Sultan of Asfahan set fire to the reeds in his kingdom. The locusts that had been living there left in search of new shelter. Intelligent monsters, feeling threatened, gathered into tribes, and panic began to spread among them. Rumors that someone had scattered bloodthirsty megalomania throughout the forest quickly spread among the various groups of creatures. Everyone envisioned a horrible, ferocious monster capable of destruction and violence. In their minds grew the picture of an indomitable monster whose leader was supposedly the devil himself. But it was really just Royd and his faithful beaver who took advantage of the situation and went into action. At this time, in the royal palace of Isfahan, the Sultan was listening to the report of his subject, who stood before him with a concerned expression on his face. He started with the orcs leaving their village and going deeper into the Magentano forest. The Sultan frowned when he heard that. "Is that a victory?" He asked how the kingdom had dealt with the orcs, hoping for a positive answer. The messenger, a little embarrassed, replied that there had been no massacre. Orcs were freely allowed into the forests. The ruler was upset because Queen Magentano was his enemy. This was not what he expected. Orcs were supposed to wreak havoc in the kingdom. The man continued, trying not to incur the Sultan's wrath. The wave of monster attacks they had launched had turned against them. The monsters are attacking their villages and causing panic among their subjects. When the Sultan heard this, he was angry. The messenger, seeing the ruler's anger, quickly added that the army was doing all it could. However, the monsters are fleeing in terror from something. They are clearly frightened by something inexplicable. The Sultan ordered all the forces of the kingdom to gather. He did not believe that the monsters could change the direction of their fury. Unless there's someone out west who's putting the fear in them. We had to find out what was going on and use it to our advantage. Meanwhile, Royd was at Frontera Manor, slipping some documents to the moneylenders for signature. It was a check for payment of the debt with interest. Mitrov and Salo stared at him in bewilderment, not believing their eyes. Royd hustled the loan sharks to sign the document as soon as possible, and off they went. At that moment, Baron Arcos entered the room. The usurers almost ran him down, running away in their haste. The Baron was followed by Merveia. Their faces expressed surprise. The Baron asked his son if it was true that he had paid the entire debt of the Frontier family. The guy nodded and showed me the signed document. He smiled and said that the debt no longer existed, holding out a piece of paper and offering to frame it. Arcos did not hold back his emotions and rushed to hug his son. Joy filled his heart. The father apologized for having to work so hard. The young man hurried to reassure the Baron. He asked if his father loved him. Arcos replied that of course he did, for Royd was his own son. The young man said that's the best reason to be happy. Family is what really matters. Walking through the mansion, Royd met Gabriel, who looked tired, yet satisfied. He reported that the evacuation of the orcs was complete. His voice was reassuring. Royd smilingly praised him. Gabriel was embarrassed by the praise and continued. He said the orcs were pleased with the new grounds and food. The young lord, feeling that everything was going according to plan, told the knight to rest and left after saying goodbye. As he walked down the corridors of the mansion, his thoughts wandered. He wondered if the monsters would come back and if the giant beaver named Bibun would chase them away again. There was some irony in that. He had finally paid off his debt, but the joy of that accomplishment didn't fill his heart. Instead, he was bored. Back in his room, Royd lay down on his bed and began to remember his father's embrace. He remembered how, in another life, his real father had also apologized to him. The memories overwhelmed him, and he couldn't hold back the tears. The young man cried because he could no longer help his father, but now, in this new world, he could do something meaningful. Tears rolled down his cheeks, and he sobbed in the loneliness of his room, releasing the heartache that was building up inside him. Gabriel entered at that moment. The knight quietly left the room when he saw that Royd was in a bad mood. A couple days after all the events, the villagers welcomed the young baron with joy. He became their idol, a symbol of hope and new life. People admired the guy, gathering in crowds to see their hero. Royd could feel how infuriated he was by the attention he was receiving. The noise and excitement around him became unbearable. Gabriel, noticing that the gentleman looked annoyed, advised him to try to savor the moment. These people are alive and smiling because of Royd. He had a hand in it. The young baron sighed, averting his gaze from the mirth. Sometimes it becomes too much. At that moment, Byron came running towards them. His face was contorted with anxiety. He reported, panting, that a crowd of men was coming from the south. The boys asked him what kind of people they were. Was it really the army of a neighboring country? Byron replied, pointing south, that they were refugees. They seemed to look scared and exhausted. Royd and Gabriel went out to meet the refugees, feeling a sense of responsibility for those who needed help in their land. As they approached, the people turned to Royd as the owner of these lands. The young baron explained that he was the son of the owner, a little embarrassed by this treatment. The leader of the refugees, a tall and brave young man, introduced himself as Nicholas. They came from the south, from Baron Sortino. His father was a village elder. The elder told everyone to leave and stayed with Baron Sortino to defend the land. Royd looked at Nicholas warily and asked what had happened. I wondered if the monsters had attacked again. The poor man's face showed fear and fatigue. He replied that they were attacked by beetles 2 meters tall. There were a lot of them. The Baron's son and the knight looked at each other. Their eyes reflected the same thought. It was a serious threat. Apparently, all the border regions with Asfahan were affected. Only the haciendas of Frontera and Racona could accommodate refugees and provide protection. The young baron was suddenly afraid. He didn't know how many more people would arrive and whether their small estate would be able to accommodate them all. The unfortunate refugees fell to their knees and begged for help. Their faces were full of fear and hope. Gabriel looked at this and asked Royd if he had a plan. The gentleman made a grimace like a madman and suddenly burst out laughing. He said it was very exciting. His voice sounded strange and cheerful. The knight perplexedly asked what he was even thinking in such a situation. The guy grinned unpleasantly and explained to him, "It's a good thing they have people coming to them. They'll be able to collect a lot of taxes from them." Azrahan was shocked at this approach. He didn't know if it was a joke or not. People often face such situations, and the Lord cares about taxes. Royd ignored Gabriel's reaction and sprang into action. He shouted for Byrne to reclassify the construction workers as cooks and feed the people. Byron nodded and hurriedly carried out the order. The grateful people expressed their appreciation. The young baron, feeling that everything was going according to plan, decided it was time to tell his father. Arcos must know what was going on and how they could help. The older knight, noticing that Gabriel was reacting too emotionally to Royd's behavior, told him to calm down. In his opinion, the young baron was a good man. Since his motives were unknown, he would just have to see what happened next. Gabriel agreed, a little relieved. His master had never let him down lately after all. Meanwhile, at Frontera Manor, Baron Arcos was horrified when he learned of the approaching refugees. He exclaimed that they would not be able to accommodate so many people. His face was full of anxiety. There would be enough food for a couple of days, and then they would have to go hungry. Royd said confidently that they had plenty of food. He remembered the dead locusts that had come to their land after the Asfahan fire. Baroness Baron and Royd stood in the hangar in front of a pile of lifeless locusts, discussing how to use this unusual solution to feed the refugees. Arcos began to say that it was not good to feed the refugees with locusts. Suddenly, Merveia decided not to waste time and went to the pile, taking the locusts and starting to eat them. The Baron almost fainted at the sight. He was horrified, unable to believe that his wife was eating locusts. Merwe ignored his shock and continued chewing. "It tasted like shrimp," she said with a smile, though she added that they smelled strange. The Baroness, noticing his bewilderment, offered to lead a team of cooks. They would add spices to make it more palatable to the refugees. Royd enthusiastically supported the idea and agreed. If they could cook the locusts in a way that made them taste good, it would help feed everyone in need. Meanwhile, a tent camp was set up near the forest. The orcs assisted the refugees in getting settled by providing them with the necessary items and support. The young Baron, watching the process, noticed another 100 refugees from the north approaching. He was pleased, not expecting them to come so quickly. With this determination, he began to act, realizing that a great deal of work lay ahead. Royd, along with Podong, were active in building heating for the tent camp, ensuring refugees were comfortable in the cold weather. People from neighboring villages also found employment. This helped them feel part of the new community. Meanwhile, the Baroness was in the kitchen teaching the girls how to cook locusts. Many of them resisted at first, not understanding how to eat the insect. Manhwa, noticing their displeasure, approached with an ancient book written by a girl who once worked as a cook for a dragon. When the girls saw the title of the book and learned its origin, they were stunned. Interest in the legendary book, found among the black magician's belongings, quickly increased. The young baron sat on a hillock looking at the tent camp and worried that the refugees might not fit in. The space was too small. He noticed a mother and child crying and longing for the home they no longer had. This scene touched his heart deeply. Thinking back to his childhood and home in another life, Royd felt nostalgia and pain flare up inside him. When his parents bought their shabby apartment in the suburbs, they were so happy. Kim Soo-hong never saw such smiles on their faces again. Now, he promised himself that he would provide a home for this baby no matter what it cost him. Gabriel stood nearby, watching the gentleman. He must be up to something again. The young baron said that they were now starting to build a new level. The knight, as usual, did not understand much, but remained silent. Royd was going to build an apartment complex for refugees, the likes of which had never been seen before in these parts. The boy standing on the top of the mountain felt full of strength and ambition. His gaze stretched to the endless expanse, and vivid images appeared in his mind. He envisioned a modern apartment complex that would become not just housing, but a real salvation for refugees. The idea seemed brilliant to him, to build a cozy place where people could start a new life and, at the same time, bring in revenue through higher taxes. His hysterical laughter was caused by the combination of the simplicity and madness of the thought. Gabriel, standing nearby, cast a look of bewilderment at the gentleman. The young baron continued to dream of the untold riches his ambitious project would bring him. He imagined never having to work again and entrusting the management to Bayern. Then, he would raise a successor if he decided to retire. In the baron's study, the council met again, and Royd, full of enthusiasm, presented his honeyed apartment complex. The boy expected approval and delight, but Gabriel didn't hesitate to say that the title sounded too narcissistic. But the gentleman, annoyed by the criticism, abruptly asked him to shut up, not wanting anyone to question his vision. Meanwhile, Byrne was sitting at the table feeling ill. He remembered a strange dream in which he had worked for the devil, which added to his anxiety and doubts. The young baron passionately showed a blueprint of a fortress-type building, eager to explain how this design would become a symbol of strength and stability. Royd was inspired by his idea to outline the construction of a square complex that would become even more practical and attractive. The center was designed to create public spaces for residents to socialize and foster community growth. He also suggested installing a steel gate at the entrance to make the building appear like an impregnable fortress, which would enhance its credibility. Those gathered around the table gave in to Royd's enthusiasm and cheered at the prospect of a new project. Gabriel was vigilant and raised an important question: where the Lord was going to obtain the materials, since there were barely enough resources for the refugees. The young baron, not wanting to hear the criticism, interrupted him. He said he would not leave the refugees without help. It would be the best help he could offer them. His confidence and determination were so strong that the rest of the council supported Royd, who then embraced his vision. Royd, realizing the need to support the refugees, announced that they would continue to build heated tents to provide temporary shelter. After the discussion, Royd and Gabriel decided to go on a trip to discuss the next steps. Gabriel, however, seemed to be in a bad mood. He took offense and did not speak to the master, which made the latter uneasy. Royd couldn't shake the thought of whether they could accomplish their project, and it was tormenting him from the inside out. As a leader, he knew he shouldn't show doubt, but inner excitement was building within him. He knew that only Gabriel could bring him down and bring him back to reality, but now his silence only emphasized the growing distance between them. The knight suddenly realized that he had become just an emotional outlet for Royd, and this discovery made him very angry. Fury flared inside him, especially when he noticed the way Royd's face twisted as if laughing at him. Gabriel's mind whirled with the thought of how he could punch Royd in the face for being disrespectful. Still, in reality, he just kept silent, suppressing his emotions. After arriving at Raycon's manor, the guys walking through the corridors unexpectedly met Diego, with whom Royd had once had an altercation at the Royal Academy. The boy looked depressed, as if his life had lost its meaning. The young baron, not noticing the tension in the atmosphere, greeted Diego cheerfully. His voice sounded friendly, but underneath it was a subtle hint of mockery. Diego recoiled in horror from Royd, as if he were a ghost from his past. The boy started calling for his father, with a tremor in his voice. Ignoring Diego's fear, the boy reassured him that he had come to return the teenager to the academy. He ordered that Viscount Raccoon be summoned. When he met with the Viscount, Royd stated bluntly that he was going to raise the water tax. The Viscount was furious when he heard this, but he held back. He went to the window, trying to calm down and think about the situation. The man began to explain that the price in the contract was fixed, but the young baron took out a magnifying glass and pointed to a small notation in the contract. According to this clause, the price may change depending on the supplier's mood. The Viscount, not wanting to believe his ears, shouted at Royd about fraud, but the latter, remaining unperturbed, urged him not to boil over. Royd explained to Raccoon that he was offering an exchange. When the monsters began to invade, the refugees first ran to the Viscount, but he chased them away. If the Queen finds out about this, she'll be depressed. The boy's threatening words made the Viscount think seriously. The boy's words, full of threats, made the Viscount think seriously. He added that he may offer to write a letter of recommendation to the Queen to encourage Diego's reinstatement to the Academy. This statement seemed to hang in the air, and Gabriel stared at his host, bewildered by his audacity and fearlessness. The Viscount, feeling the ground slipping from under his feet, became angrier than ever. He asked in a trembling voice how much the young baron intended to raise the tax. Royd answered that not by much. There was a dramatic pause, and a palpable tension filled the air. Everyone fell silent. No one knew how this conflict would end. Still, those present realized that the situation had escalated to an extreme level. The guy noticed that Racona was clearly confused and decided to tease him. He asked how much he thought the tax would be raised. The man stammered the word 20 as if trapped in a trap. When he saw Royd's displeased face, he hastened to correct himself. He said he meant 30. The young baron made an unpleasant face again. The boy was clearly not going to agree to such terms. Gabriel tried to help by pointing to the number 5 on his fingers, suggesting that this was a reasonable option. Racona shouted in panic that he would increase the payment by 50%. But Royd was not satisfied with that answer either. The knight again showed the number 5, but the Viscount was already hysterical, exclaiming that he would pay 5 times as much. At this point, the young baron besought him, saying that it was enough to pay 4 times as much. The Vicomte was suddenly happy to agree and signed the new contract, thinking that he had managed to get out of the situation with minimal losses. Happy Royd and Gabriel left Raccoon Manor and headed back to Frontera Manor, discussing their plans for the future. However, the Viscount returned to the document and began to reread the contract again, realizing that he had fallen into a trap and his joy might be premature. Gabriel felt sad and depressed, as if he had become a thief involved in Royd's dubious dealings. Inside himself, he realized that not only was his master a crook, but he had become an extortionist to some extent by helping him in this. This thought made him angry, and he sharply said that he had to guard the Lord, but he was not obliged to be on the run, and he would not participate in the construction. Royd tried to lighten the atmosphere with a smile, noting that he would no longer tell him about engineering before bed to help the knight fall asleep. Azrahan, not wanting to give in, replied that he didn't need it anymore because he could fall asleep himself now. At night, lying in his room, Gabriel couldn't sleep a wink. Finally, he decided he had to talk to Royd. When he came to the young baron, he said with a disgruntled look that the service was no longer available. The knight, unwilling to give up, began to beg him to give a boring lecture on engineering. Instead, the guy decided to change the subject and started telling him about sleep hygiene, explaining how important it was to maintain a regimen and make him comfortable. Gabriel interrupted Royd to say that he was familiar with sleep hygiene and that he didn't need moralizing. The guy relented and continued to load Gabriel's brain with engineering, emphasizing essential aspects of design. Gabriel eventually fell asleep, and the young baron wasted no time in getting to work. He began to visualize his new apartment complex project, realizing that knowledge was not enough to bring it to life. His motto in life, however, was simple: work till you make it. In the morning, Royd was already giving out orders. He had sent men to Cremo to fetch foremen and laborers, as well as to purchase building materials and provisions. He continued to design, becoming increasingly immersed in the details. Byrne announced that 300 more refugees were on their way. Royd didn't hesitate to say that they would take them all in. However, the project began to stall under the pressure of growing needs. The strain caused his nose to bleed, and he felt fatigue overtake him. Byrne later reported that there were only enough resources for 4 months. It might be worth considering moving the refugees to other lands. A tired young man trying to assure the senior knight that everything was fine and that they would manage to accommodate the refugees suddenly fainted. Everyone around him got excited and rushed over to him. They tried to bring the boy to his senses, but he wouldn't wake up. Meanwhile, in the kingdom of Magentano, many archers gathered in the square. They pointed their weapons at the queen standing in the center. They fired 1,000 arrows, and at that moment, The queen concentrated on gathering all her mana. Applying the sword aura technique, she reflected all the arrows that flew apart as if they had collided with an invisible barrier. However, she had a sad expression on her face. Her abilities were not developing, and it tormented her. The training was interrupted by a servant who entered the hall and reported that there was news from Frontera Manor. The queen was wary, realizing that something terrible had clearly happened. At that moment, Gabriel entered the hall with a message. He felt responsible for his lords and asked the queen to give them a helping hand. Alicia listened to him intently, imbued with the gravity of the situation. I wonder what exactly Royd needed this time, because he's always been able to cope with difficulties on his own. Gabriel continued his report by describing the critical situation at Frontera Manor. He said tensely that they were struggling to accommodate the refugees. Refugees from 17 provinces had lost their homes and came to Frontera Manor for help. Alicia listened intently to Azrahan. He emphasized the importance of his address, praising the queen for her wisdom, which helped position her for Royd's tearful request. However, as the knight continued to read the letter, his face became serious. The young baron wrote that he was broke. Alicia was furious when she heard that. Royd's insolence was apparent, especially since she was about to send him help. But that was not all. The young man continued that the gentleman intended to ask for 3 times as much. This made the queen furious, but she could barely keep from unleashing her anger on the knight. Royd's letter described his plans to build an apartment complex, but unfortunately, he lacked the necessary funds to do so. The queen interrupted him, saying that she understood the request. There was no need to read any further. She took a deep breath and added that she could not spend the money from the treasury wherever she wanted and needed to consult with the ministers. The elders must also give permission for this event, Royd. However, getting their consent was not so easy. But Gabriel continued to read the next part of the letter, where Royd described his ambitious plans. The new dwelling was to be a fortress of protection. In the kingdom of Magentano, peace and quiet will finally come, wrote the young baron, assuring that his project would bring the long-awaited stability. He also added that if the queen supports this endeavor, she will receive a gift in return. The queen looked at Gabriel skeptically, thinking about Royd's words. She argued that building a fortress was necessary and vital. The ministers would support her decision, given her authority. When the knight read the word bingo written in the letter, neither of them understood what it meant. Alicia only raised her eyebrows without giving it much thought. The letter also had a postscript requesting the royal artisan Corhitus. The queen thought for a moment. Then, the woman irritably said she understood and ordered Azrahan to wait until she returned with the money. Meanwhile, the refugees were comfortably settled in the tent camp. The soldiers and orcs were helping them. Among the soldiers was Sergeant Greg, who was once known as lazy and slow. But being constantly around the young baron soon changed him. He wanted to be at the center of events and take part in everything. As he left the tent, Sergeant Greg noticed Emily's maid. He approached her with a smile and said hello. He offered to help, but Emily laughed and declined, assuring him she could handle it on her own. They started having fun and joking around. The atmosphere around them was light and relaxed. The orc, who had protected Emily from the locusts earlier, approached them. He was holding a bouquet of flowers in his hand, which he looked like he was going to give her. But as soon as he saw Emily laughing and chatting with Greg, his mood immediately changed. The orc became saddened at the realization that he was competing with a man who aroused the girl's genuine interest. His kin, watching, began to laugh and tease him, sure that Emily would have rejected the young orc. Frustrated and hurt, the young man threw the flowers to the ground. He turned back toward the forest, feeling his heart clench with pain. However, Emily noticed the orc's distressed state and called out to him. She realized he was in love, and it made her feel something special. At that time, Royd woke up from fainting in his bed. His body was exhausted, and his mind had not yet fully returned to reality. He had a strange dream. He whispered to Byrne, sitting beside him, that there was not much left. The young baron was delirious, and dreaded the day when he would have to give his workers their wages, and there was nothing to pay. Byron, trying to calm his master, offered to move the payday, assuring that everyone would understand the situation and be sympathetic. But the boy continued to speak incoherently. His thoughts were confused, and at some point, his eyes closed again. The eldest knight was horrified when he saw this. He thought that his master might have passed away. In a panic, the man called for a doctor. At that moment, the door swung open, and Gabriel entered the room. He looked as if he were illuminated by the light, and in his hands was the money given by the queen. The knight told the lord to get up and hand the money to Royd. His voice was full of hope, and it awakened the boy from his heavy thoughts. It was as if the young baron had been reborn when he heard the word money. His mind flashed with a new understanding of the possibilities that lay ahead of him. At that moment, the system informed him that he had obtained a new skill called Financial Hill. This meant that Frontera Manor had received funds for the Royal City project, and another of Royd's plans was about to come to fruition. Bayern commanded the construction site with confidence, and the apartment complex project was already 70% complete. Royd walked out to the vacant lot where the new buildings were soon to be planned and began to visualize the skyscrapers, imagining them towering toward the sky. In his imagination, he tested them against various natural disasters, even modeling a meteorite fall. He laughed hysterically and felt a burst of creative energy. Gabriel, standing nearby, thought again that his master was a little strange. When Royd noticed the look on his face, he asked what was wrong. The knight, trying to hide his thoughts, replied that he didn't think his master was crazy at all. At that moment, the workers in the dwarf Corhitus arrived from the kingdom. The young baron immediately took the initiative to address the dwarves. He said he needed a special recipe for cement. It had to be mixed with a cement mixer. He had a diagram of the machine in his hand. However, Corhitus, feeling offended, objected that he was being forced to work at once without even being offered a meal from the road. However, the guy knew that to entice the gnome, he had to show him the project immediately. He held out the blueprint to Corhitus, and the latter asked interestedly if his workstation was ready. Gabriel and Royd then worked together to prepare the base for the cement mixer. It was a big barrel with a wheel driven by Pipodong. The orcs weren't idle either. They were preparing rebar rods. The young baron was showing Bayern how to properly pour the cement, explaining the process step by step. The building got taller and taller, and soon there was a need for the help of a giant beaver to carry the building materials upstairs. Bebon was happy to be around his snake friend Belle. Everyone worked harmoniously, and soon the skyscraper began to take shape before our eyes. Royd, full of energy and enthusiasm, asked Byrne if he could manage without him. The senior knight assured the lord that the project was in good hands. Royd decided to attend to other matters, and his attention was drawn to the problems with the heating system's insulation. The system functioned thanks to a steam boiler, and the steam was piped to the batteries. However, the higher up the pipes went, the less heat they gave off. The young baron did not sleep nights trying to find a way out of this situation, but all his efforts did not bring success. One day, amid his musings, he remembered an episode in the book where Gabriel fought a dragon. It was an epic battle. Despite Azrahan's strength and agility, it was not easy to defeat the dragon. Gabriel was victorious thanks to the armor impregnated with the resin of the Alentia tree. It was the best insulation in the magical world. Inspired by this thought, the guy decided that they needed to hike for this resin. They had been walking for 2 days, but the knight still didn't know the plan. At one point, he couldn't stand it and asked where they were going. He replied that they were on their way to the land of the elves, to be exact, to the ever-shining forest. Gabriel heard this and turned around, hurrying back the way he had come. He told the astonished gentleman that it was in vain, for everyone knows that elves hate humans. But that didn't stop Royd. He replied that he would go alone and strode confidently forward. Eventually, Gabriel, not wanting to leave the lord alone, gave up and followed him. Trying to encourage Royd to think, he said that no one had dealt with elves in nearly 500 years. It was unlikely they would welcome a visit, but Royd calmed him down. He said he wasn't even going to negotiate with them. He intended to rob them. Then, the greedy smile that the knight hated so much reappeared on his face. Azrahan thought he no longer wished to be knighted by this asshole. The travelers cautiously entered the elves' domain and immediately felt the magic of the place. All around were magnificent trees, shimmering with all the colors of the rainbow, and the light shining through the leaves created an atmosphere that felt like a fairy tale. Royd held back his excitement and told Gabriel to be quiet so the elves wouldn't notice them before they did. However, at the most inopportune moment, the knight sneezed. The young baron frowned and told him not to do it again. It annoyed him that even at times like this, Gabriel remained handsome and attracted attention. Gabriel laughingly replied that the gentleman had better accept that he wasn't as handsome. This joke hurt Royd, and he said resentfully that a consummate swordsman should be able to restrain himself. He only joked that he couldn't contain his physical needs and laughed sonorously. When asked by Royd what was the matter, the lad replied with a smile that the gentleman had changed the subject because he could not compete with him in beauty. This teasing finally pissed off the young baron, and he couldn't resist pouncing on his friend with his fists. Gabriel smiled easily, deftly deflected his blows, and enjoyed the game. His great mood only fueled the situation. Royd, realizing there was nothing he could do about his servant's good mood, simply ordered him not to sneeze. They moved deeper into the forest, where, according to legend, the Alencia tree grew. Suddenly, Royd and Gabriel's path was blocked by the elves pointing their weapons at them. The young baron didn't understand how they had been spotted, but the elfess said with an icy stare that they had yelled as they entered the forest. The knight, realizing that they were in distress, said that they seemed to be finished, but Royd answered without giving up hope that all was not lost. The fact that the elves had found them would only hasten their actions. The elves threatened to shoot if the aliens didn't leave, and Gabriel gathered his strength, activating his sword aura. Suddenly, the archers fired arrows, but the knight skillfully deflected them with his sword, surprising the elf. She was amazed that he was indeed a master swordsman. While Gabriel was distracting the elf's attention, Royd, following a premeditated plan, ran to find a tree. When the elfess ordered her companions to run after the handsome man, Royd heard this, and he felt resentful that he was considered ugly. The main thing was that the elves ran after Gabriel, which meant their diversion plan had worked. The elves were familiar with the forest and moved silently, which made the situation even more difficult. Royd remembered explaining to the knight before that the elves were very protective of the forest. You couldn't attack them. You could only repel attacks and evade them. Gabriel, pursued by the elves, was trapped. They shot at him, and he struggled to dodge the arrows, but the elves seemed to have a plan. They swept left and right, making the knight lose concentration, and also to avoid hitting the plants. At that moment, Royd reached the Alencia tree. Its majestic trunk towered like the guardian of the forest. He concentrated and, using his skill as a lifer, started digging. The guy could feel no fatigue for a full 20 minutes and quickly dug a trench under the ground that resembled a burrow. Meanwhile, Gabriel, fighting the elves, noticed that their leader was missing among them. He ran out to the river and was confused. Now, he had nowhere to hide. Suddenly, a crowd of elves came at him, firing thousands of arrows. The knight gathered his strength and used his sword aura to defeat all the arrows flying in his direction. The forest dwellers saw how easily he deflected their blows and became furious. They didn't understand why he didn't retaliate against them, but they had a trump card up their sleeve. Suddenly, everything went quiet. Gabriel felt someone's presence and turned around. A powerful elven woman stepped out from behind the trees. It seemed to be their best fighter. In her hand was the great dragon's giant bow, and she prepared to shoot. The knight, realizing the threat, prepared to fend off her attack. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and concentrated and waited for her to release her arrow. The elves drew the bowstring, took aim, and released a giant arrow. Gabriel summoned all his strength to repel her. He needed to protect himself and find a way to divert the elves' attention, while Royd went about his task. The knight could barely withstand the powerful arrow that possessed incredible strength. He knew it was wrong to hurt an elf. His kin would be avenged for the rest of his days. When the forest dwellers fired 1,000 arrows again, Gabriel felt his time was running out. He didn't know what he should do. They were supposed to be meeting with Royd by now, and the boy desperately hoped his master was up to the task. Once again, gathering his strength, Azrahan activated the sword aura technique. The powerful elfess, without giving him a second to rest, released one after another giant arrow. Gabriel reflected one of them with his sword and changed its direction. The two arrows collided and ricocheted, resulting in a massive explosion. All the surrounding nature shook from the impact. Meanwhile, Royd had successfully reached the root of the Alencia tree. He was diligently stuffing a whole backpack full of roots when suddenly someone called him out, calling him a diabolical freak. The young baron turned around and saw several elves aiming at him. Their gazes were full of anger. One of them asked angrily how he dared to bring harm to their tree.